Some call it the game of everything, the one where you build an empire to stand the test of time, and of course one of the greatest and most influential PC games ever made. Sid Meier's Civilization is indisputably a masterpiece, and it's one of my favourite games, one that, like many others, I've spent ages on, curtailing all other activities in favour of just one more turn. It's the best, and I've had the urge to do something on Civ for ages now. But covering the whole thing is, well, kinda huge in scope, so for now I'm restricting myself purely to the making of that very first game, because it's actually quite a story. So many things were going against Civilization, from legal troubles to the difficulties of design to just how much Microprose cared about it, that honestly it's a wonder it ever came out at all. It could have so easily failed or been cancelled. Eventually, however, it made it. And so, let's have a look at just how it all came together. As far as background goes, we have to start by looking at the foundation of Microprose itself, because it's hard to think of two people more different from each other than Microprose's founders. This pairing would have, in ordinary circumstances, never ever gotten together. They have literally nothing in common, and yet fate would have their paths cross. On one hand you have a coder, a quiet man working as a systems engineer for General Instruments. He was pretty passionate about coding in his personal life too, particularly for his beloved Atari 800. He'd even set up a users group for local enthusiasts in Baltimore's Hunt Valley for the machine, which was, in all honesty, basically a software pirating group. This man's name was Sid Meier. And on the other hand, also working for General Instruments, but in a considerably higher role, you had a former Air Force pilot. A loud, jockish personality, the sort who would dominate all conversations he was involved in. Some might call him the very epitome of an ugly American, even, although his ability in business wasn't in question. This man was John William Steely, although he'd be much better known as Wild Bill Steely. There is absolutely no way on earth that this nerd and this jock should conceivably even meet each other, let alone start a business. But in May 1982, they would find each other. The legendary story goes that both Sid and Bill had been sent by General Instruments, along with various other employees, to a bunch of dull business conferences in Las Vegas, and they both found themselves at an arcade in the basement of the MGM Grand playing the air combat game Red Baron. Wild Bill, being a former pilot, naturally fancied his hand at the game and ended up scoring 75,000 points. The very next player to step up was Sid. He doubled Bill's score with ease and only stopped playing after getting bored. Wild Bill asked Sid how he could have possibly beaten a former Air Force pilot, and Sid said that he'd memorised the handful of patterns that the enemies were programmed to follow through watching him play, and that he could make a better game than that. Bill said that if Sid could make a better game, he could sell it. Some months later, Sid met Bill again with a disc containing the game Hellcat Ace, a World War II shoot-'em-up in the vein of Red Baron. Wild Bill critiqued it very heavily, using his own experience as, of course, a former Air Force pilot. This is after all something you'd probably find out about Wild Bill within seconds of meeting him. But Sid didn't let the criticism thwart him. A week later he came back to Wild Bill, having fixed every mistake that he'd pointed out. Sid may have been a quiet, unassuming nerd, but that didn't mean he wasn't determined. And so that was it. The systems engineer and planning director, the nerd and the jock, joined forces. Sid Meier had made the game, but could Wild Bill Steely sell it, as he said he could? The early days of Microprose are filled with fun stories of the company asserting themselves in various ways, usually through the immense personality of Wild Bill Steely. This is how he generally went about gradually getting Hellcat Ace into stores all over the country. He would call stores posing as a customer, inquiring about the game. When said store inevitably said they didn't have it in stock, Steely would act thoroughly aggrieved, questioning and ranting about their lousy service and saying that he would be taking his business elsewhere. He would often do this multiple times to a single store, the absolute customer that anyone who works in retail would dearly love to punch square in the mouth. Inevitably though, he would phone the store back up as himself, saying that he would like to sell Hellcat Ace to the store. And of course the manager would accept, thankful for the chance to stop being harangued by these bloody customers desperate for this game, and so Hellcat Ace would be in another store. For a small two-person operation's first title, it didn't do all that badly, and there'd be plenty more to come. Wild Bill, as promised, did sell the game. Of course, this is not a big history on Microprose itself. The company would get larger as Sid continued to churn out games before other people such as Andy Hollis, Arnold Hendrick and Grant Irani joined the operation. Sid and Bill were great business partners because they were so different. They weren't necessarily friends, but each had most of the things that the other lacked. Neither could have been a success without the other's work. Sid was quiet and almost obstinate, sticking with his Atari 800 and even his regular job at General Instruments almost to a fault, even after Wild Bill himself had quit to run Microprose full time. He didn't much like to get involved in the business side either, to the point where fairly early on he requested that Bill actually buy his share out. Sid Meier would stay with the company as a sort of super contractor, but having no ties to the boardroom meant he could devote himself totally to creating games. Microprose became a big name in the mid to late 80s as the studio for military combat simulators, usually of the flying variety, particularly after the huge success of games like F-15 Strike Eagle, Gunship and Silent Service. Wild Bill Steely became a bigger-than-life character, happy enough to play an even more exaggerated version of himself, if that was possible. He now described himself as an ex-fighter pilot, even though his experience was mainly in transport, training and light combat aircraft as opposed to supersonic jets. Microprose even kept an old T-28 Trojan plane on the books, mainly so that Wild Bill could take an unsuspecting journalist up into the skies and scare the absolute hell out of them with some acrobatics. The American press tended to absolutely lap this up, although the European press were less keen. Some of their games were even quite controversial over here. West Germany blacklisted F-15, Gunship and Silent Service for their glorification of warfare. They were, though, without a doubt, the military simulation studio, and Wild Bill was pretty happy with that. As the 80s wore on, however, Sid Meier felt the need to branch out somewhat. The huge success of Meier-designed games such as F-15 Strike Eagle and Silent Service had not only made Microprose a successful studio, they'd also made his name and reputation as a successful coder and designer. But flight or submarine combat sims weren't exactly something that Sid was happy to do forever, even if Wild Bill was perfectly happy for Microprose to release nothing but those sort of games. Sid really had to convince Wild Bill that his latest game, something totally different from the hoorah-tastic sims Microprose were known for, was a banker. Even on a personal level, Wild Bill had no interest in anything but vehicular combat sims. In the end, the reputation of Sid was enough to seal the game's release, to the point where, after all the critical and commercial success he'd had with his previous games, Microprose saw fit to really tie his reputation to the game. Sid's name would be in the title. The suggestion for this, apparently, came from none other than Robin Williams. Yes, that Robin Williams. The late great comedian and avid gamer was entertaining at a Software Publishers Association dinner, making everyone laugh. He turned to Wild Bill and said that, with Sid's games being as successful as they were, maybe he should put Sid's name on the box and promote him as the star. Now Robin was, of course, joking, but Wild Bill saw something in it, and when Sid made his push, Wild Bill decided to run the play. Still, having your own name on the game? Now that's a bit of pressure, to be honest. I mean, think about it. If the game had been a load of crap, perhaps we'd have never heard the name of Sid Meier ever again. Fortunately, said game was the 1987 classic Sid Meier's Pirates. This open-ended game where you take on the life of a sea dog in the Caribbean and can basically do whatever you wish, from being a scourge to all nations to a privateer that helps empires out in times of war, was a revelation. Even though the idea of taking on a person's whole career had already been explored in the Arnold Hendrick designed Gunship, Pirates offered way more freedom even than that, with no set missions as such. You were left to your own devices, free to roam, with every new expedition offering the promise of something different and the chance to better your prospects come the time you finally retire. You could hunt for treasure, raid towns and capture the silver train, marry a governor's daughter. There was seemingly no end to the game's freedom, and it was naturally a big hit. Wild Bill may have known nothing about any game that wasn't a flight sim, but he often trusted in Sid Meier's instincts, and he was certainly correct to do so here. But Sid would soon take his exploration of open-ended games a few steps further. Sid has made no bones about the game that inspired him to really plunge into games that were more open-ended, sim-like and based around building a world. Will Wright's seminal 1989 title SimCity was, for Sid, a revelation, something that utterly gripped him as it did many others. Meier was introduced to the game by the man he'd picked out as his assistant at Microprose, Bruce Shelley, who had previously spent a fairly unremarkable few years working for tabletop game giants Avalon Hill. However, if there was one thing that Sid wished SimCity did have, it was an actual goal of sorts. Whether it was a competition with others or just some sort of final mark that signified the game's end. Needless to say, the game would become a major influence on the projects that Sid was then working on most of the time, the game that was, at that point, called the Golden Age of Railroads. Taking both influence from his experience and his critique of SimCity, Sid turned what was at this point little more than a virtual toy train simulator into much more of a challenge that required the player to be more logical in their implementation of routes between cities in order to run a successful railroad, with the addition of resources that needed to be transported and, later on in development, several other railway barons to compete against in a game of efficient networking and economic strategy. While Sid was undoubtedly the lead designer, Shelley's role was important as a sounding board and partner in crime, occasionally one who had ideas of his own, to the point where he was credited as co-designer on the eventual game, Sid Meier's Railroad Tycoon. Some people, such as Avalon Hill's president Eric Dott, may have sneered at this credit. Dott saw the game as somewhat similar to a tabletop title by the name of 1830 Railways and Robber Barons that Bruce Shelley had actually worked on during his time at the company. Ultimately, Wild Bill was able to sort out this diplomatic spat with no damage, but there would be a sequel later on. However, in any case, Meier and Shelley spent a whole load of time immersing themselves not just in this game, but in everything about the history of the railroad. This had become a labour of love, a game of passion. It wasn't just risky on a commercial level, seeing as Microprose weren't exactly known for games like this, it was risky on a personal level. This wasn't even the game that Sid Meier was supposed to be working on. Sid's main project was supposed to be the spy game Covert Action, a much more traditionally Microprose type project, one that a previous designer had abandoned and had been left to Sid to sort out. And yet Sid himself wasn't able to really convert it into, for him, a particularly satisfying game. Or rather, he perhaps wasn't devoting as much time as he should to that because of his interest in the railroad game. He made no bones about Railroad Tycoon being the much more fun and better project. This aggrieved Wild Bill somewhat. Covert Action had already cost a lot of money, and he didn't exactly want Sid to abandon it. But rather than open up a big feud with his star designer, he decided to trust Sid's judgment for the time being and let him dive full on into this damn railroad game. And again, Railroad Tycoon would be a huge success. Even if in many ways it's overshadowed by the game that Sid Meier would do not long after, it's still often thought of as one of the greatest PC games ever made. Covert Action in the meantime, which Wild Bill forced Meier and Shelley to return to despite their desire to make a Railroad Tycoon 2 themselves, would still never quite come together for Sid. The game was pretty well received, but not to the same level, and Sid's heart was elsewhere. Sid Meier's obstinacy when it came to Railroad Tycoon, in the end, was a correct choice, even if it wasn't necessarily because of Sid's personal attachment to it. Microprose had made their name as Lee Flight Simulator Studio, but their success in the field had started to reach saturation point. There weren't a lot of other places they could go. Worse still, they'd had their first serious failures. An attempt to establish a European hub was an unmitigated disaster fraught with Wild Bill personally accusing the UK managers of embezzling money, miscommunication at every level, essentially being shut out of the huge West German market due to the aforementioned blacklistings, and the pointless acquisition of Telecomsoft from BT. Their main labels, Firebird and Rainbird, may well fill British gamers' hearts with nostalgia, certainly does mine, but when Microprose bought them in 1990, all they really got in return was a load of old micro games that weren't exactly fit for bringing back home, and were by now, well, just budget titles in the European market. Another big chunk of money was spent on an arcade version of F-15 Strike Eagle, which, Well, it went about as well as you'd expect an arcade game made by hardcore computer game designers to go. The end result was a technically excellent but highly expensive machine that was way more complex and had a way longer playtime than basically every other arcade game on the market. It went against quite literally every tenet of basic arcade game design. No one wanted to buy it, and it was a gigantic flop. Really, the studio had to diversify. It had to move away from the military combat sims, even if Wild Bill didn't exactly want to do that. Sid Meier may never have been the most commercially minded games designer in the field, but he would drag Microprose to this state of diversification, and, however unwittingly, for at least some time, help keep the company afloat. It wouldn't have happened without his next game. Sid Meier started work on what would become Civilization, alone, in around about late 1989 or early 1990. Again, his first inspiration was exploring what could be done with a concept like SimCity. How about instead of just a single city simulator, you were able to simulate a whole country? You would be able to build a whole network of cities, linked together through roads, mines, irrigation and other various resources. Some of the intricate details of city life would be a bit more abstract, of course. By this time, Sid had just about nailed his philosophy of world-building games that above all else were built around being fun to play. And at this stage, like Railroad Tycoon and SimCity before it, this would be a real-time game. Civilization didn't stay a real-time game for long, however. Whereas the addition of competing tycoons in Railroad was basically shoehorned in at the last minute, Meier built his game very early on around the concept of countries, real-life empires in fact, roughly based on the personality traits of real leaders, competing against each other. And it was quickly decided that the best way to do this was to make the game turn-based. A large chunk of this was because, naturally, the main way that countries would likely be competing against each other would be on the battlefield. They would have military units at their disposal that could fight anywhere on the map and take opposing cities over. Sid has admitted quite candidly that the turn-based military strategy portion of Civilization was basically taken from an old 1970s strategy game called Empire that had existed in various computerized forms over the years. It's a simple system, largely based on rolls of the dice and various chances of victory that also includes a simple fog of war on the map, which when grafted onto Civilization added the slow progress of gradually discovering the world and its resources for yourself. This implementation also resulted in one of the original Civ's main foibles. Seeing as the combat system features no hit points and is totally based on a roll of the dice, while 9 times out of 10 a modern unit is going to beat a long-obsolete ancient one, there's still the chance of a lucky dice roll. Many a Civ player has been flummoxed to see an ancient Greek phalanx take out a battalion of modern tanks. Sid toiled away at Civ for months in secrecy even before bringing Bruce Shelley into the fray, again as another sounding board. As with Railroad Tycoon before it, while Shelley essentially started out as a glorified playtester, he would have plenty of input on the actual game. Again, the interests of the duo dovetailed nicely. Both of them were passionate readers of history, and this quickly gave the Civilization project much greater meaning than just being a simple game of country building. It is also perhaps why they weren't simply satisfied by giving the player a single specific way of victory, that being conquering all the other countries. If this was to essentially be a simulation of a world, then there had to be more to it than that, a whole other path. And so the concept of the Advances tree came to life. The Advances tree, or technological tree, or whatever you wish to call it, is Civilization's most famed mechanic, undoubtedly the thing that took it up another level. A whole series of interconnected advances that a civilization could research. Unlocking one led to unlocking another, and so on as the game progressed from ancient times, through medieval and the Renaissance, all the way to the modern age and beyond. And they wouldn't all be military related. Many of the advances would instead result in improvements in your city, or in how you were able to run your civilization, and ultimately in an altogether different way to win the game. The science victory, achievable by reaching the end of the chart and then building a spaceship that would make your way to Alpha Centauri. The whole thing was created through many hours of passionate discussion between Sid and Bruce as to just what was important enough to be there. It was no small task, considering that they were discussing basically everything and deciding which of humanity's achievements should be included. As it happens, it wouldn't be the first tech tree to be included in a computer game. Sensible Software's Megalomania beat it by a couple of months. However, the severe trouble with that game's distribution soon after its release, Robert Maxwell's death and the destruction of Mirrorsoft, naturally meant that Civilization was able to pick up this particular dropped baton. Much of Civilization occurs in this great abstract. Battles take hundreds of years, wars take thousands, buildings take hundreds of years just to take shape. For whatever reason though, this never seems unbelievable. The player almost takes it as face value that simply building a granary isn't just building a granary, it represents so much more than that. And this illusion exists in everything, from building one of the game's wonders to simply moving a unit a single square. All of this was, of course, conscious. Sid Meier did not wish to get dogged down in what he felt were needless details of logic. The same was true with Railroad Tycoon, where single journeys between cities could take years. But of course, that single journey represents so much more than just one journey. While Railroad Tycoon is often shown a disservice by being treated as simply the predecessor to Civ, it's undoubtedly true that Civilization could not have existed without all the work Sid had done on his previous game. It all allowed him to formulate a philosophy and take all of it, and then some, into Civilization. There were many stages where he and Bruce could have called it a day and released a good if simple strategy game or country builder, but they continued to push for something greater. Ultimately, there was an endpoint. Sid and Bruce had no desire to look into the future beyond the flight of fancy that was Alpha Centauri, and the inclusion of flying vehicles in the game required a whole other hastily constructed layer onto the simple strategy engine that, if more had been added in the same vein, threatened to disrupt the project's delicate balance. As with Railroad Tycoon, Civilization would have a finish not long after the current day, even if it's not as hard an ending. While Railroad Tycoon is strictly limited to 100 years per game, Civ is decided after around 6,000 or so, in around 2050 AD, which translates to roughly 600 turns. One of the more irritating things about the game is that it's usually decided long before then. There tends to be a point where it's quite obvious that the player has all but won when they're so much more advanced than all the other civilizations, but there's still no way to make it official until you've either wiped out every other country or launched your spaceship and made it to Alpha Centauri. Such is the way of things. It can be forgiven when Sid and Bruce perhaps never quite set up to make something quite as grand and all-encompassing as what Civilization eventually became. It was very clear to them that what they had was something special. And yet still there were many negative forces lining up against it. Some unfairly so, others of their own creation. It's possible not only that Civ could have never received the attention it deserved, but that it could have been snuffed out in the womb. It has to be said that it's rare for an all-time classic game like Civilization to go through an entirely smooth and stress-free development cycle, coming out on time and to immediate love and massive success. There has to be some trials and tribulations along the way, and for Civ, well, there were perhaps more than most. A whole load of different problems that came home to roost almost at the same time. The backdrop of a company that had plateaued and was now falling fast, the frustrations of the game's lead designer, and past employers once again accusing the team of plagiarism. There was a lot to contend with. Let's start, once again, with the troubles that Microprose were going through. We're in about 1991 and things really aren't looking good. Attempts to expand into the console and arcade markets? They failed miserably. We already mentioned the horrendous attempt to expand into Europe, and now even the bread and butter games of the company, the flight combat sims, well, they're not doing as well as they used to. With the business running at a loss, Wild Bill resorted to a desperate measure: take the company public with an IPO. Now usually this is something that a company only does when things are going well. A successful company goes public and everyone presumably buys shares in it at a high price. This however was more like a band-aid. Do it just so we can get some money in and stem the loss. They even did the thoroughly arsehole-ish thing of stopping paying affiliate companies who published through them, just because they were looking for anything that made potential shareholders think that the company weren't losing as much money as they actually were. Times were bad. Sid Meier obviously wasn't stupid, and he could see how badly things were going at the company he'd once co-founded. In these desperate times, Microprose were trying to stick as much as possible to what they knew, forgetting about the attempts to diversify their games. It was undoubtedly for the best that Sid was just a contractor for Microsoft, albeit an exclusive and highly treasured one. If he'd been a bona fide employee, there was plenty more chance that Civilization could have been snuffed out in the womb as a cost-cutting measure because, as usual, the people at the top didn't really understand anything about what Sid Meier was doing. They left him to his own devices, and usually didn't assign much in the way of priority to him and his work. Sid Meier himself once said that he didn't think folks like Wild Bill had even the slightest clue about what they had with Civilization until the game started selling. Sid and Bruce Shelley were most certainly thinking about leaving Microprose around 1991 or so, but for whatever reason, he decided to stick on for the time being and get Civ out through Lem. There was maybe still a certain loyalty there, particularly seeing as he'd been instrumental in the formation of the company to begin with. Microprose did not necessarily thank them for this loyalty. Instead, they provided Sid and Bruce with as little resources to get the game finished as they possibly could. The actual game itself was basically done, and Bruce had even taken care of the lovingly created Civilopedia that comes with the game and tells you everything about all of its facets. But when it came to getting art done for the game, Sid and Bruce had a bit of a nightmare. Everything seemed to take an age, and the game was getting to be in danger of slipping from its planned Christmas 1991 release slot. Civilization certainly doesn't have any wow factor in the graphics department, that's for sure. Indeed, it even looks amateurish at times. And while graphics weren't necessarily a major consideration of Sid and Bruce's, a big chunk of that has to do with the lack of resources that Sid and Meier had to work with. Any people who were provided by Microprose to work on the game in art or even do things like playtesting were kinda provided begrudgingly. In the end, mainly thanks to Microprose's dawdling, the game did slip and was instead released in early 1992. And just to put the cherry on top of the whole thing, Sid and Bruce had their bonuses heavily cut because the game slipped, even though that was hardly their fault. Nice one, Microprose. Perhaps the biggest hurdle facing Civilization, however, was the anger of Avalon Hill. They'd previously been vexed before at Railroad Tycoon's perceived similarities to their game 1830, although Wild Bill had managed to smooth that over. This time, however, they and President Eric Dott were far angrier. Civilization was, after all, a 1980 board game made by Francis Tresham and then published by Avalon Hill. It was a fairly popular game too, popular enough that Avalon were planning to release an expanded rule set for the game called Advanced Civilization. Just at around the same time, Microprose were to release their game with the same name, the same sort of concept, and a whole load of other similarities beside that, from units to technological trees, with someone who already worked at Avalon Hill co-credited as the lead designer. Eric Dott was absolutely furious, and this time a simple apology wasn't going to cut it. He wanted blood. Wild Bill did, however, just about manage to smooth things over again. Over a tense lunch meeting, he managed to get Eric to agree to Microprose putting a $5 voucher for the purchase of the Civilization board game into Civilization's game box. This turned out alright for Microprose. In later interviews, Wild Bill has admitted that Eric could have easily asked for at least 10% of Civilization's profits, and considering the similarities between the two games, he'd have had a pretty good case for it. Needless to say, considering Civ's success, that 10% would have been a hell of a lot more lucrative than that $5 voucher was. As for the similarities and how intentional they were, well, that's a murky issue in many ways. Sometimes the original Civilization is simplified a bit through being called an adaptation of the board game. It certainly wasn't a direct one, but how much did it take? Sid Meier has always denied taking too much influence from the board game. He said that he only became aware of it well into Civ's production. Is he lying? It's hard to say. Sid Meier is normally pretty honest about taking heavy influence from other games, whether it's Empire or SimCity or Risk. He doesn't usually sugarcoat the truth, which suggests that he perhaps doesn't think the game influenced him much. But it probably did influence Bruce Shelley quite a bit. He'd have certainly been more aware of the game, and was more than likely the one who showed Sid the board game. Was there a certain naivety, a certain subconsciousness to this whole process? Maybe. But it's an argument that was destined to run on. A legal fight was inevitable, and it occurred in 1997 after the release of Civilization 2, with Activision also getting involved. This is a whole other issue that's hard to fully get into here, but there were suits and countersuits aplenty. The whole thing is the reason why Civ Call to Power exists, and it only came to a definite stop in 2000, when Hasbro bought both Microprose and Avalon Hill. But for now, well, Civilization's on the shelves. It's released in December of 1991. It reviews very well indeed, and initial sales are very good, probably better than the bigwigs at Microprose expected. But, most importantly, the game's numbers are still very good months later. 6 months after release, it's still hanging around the top end of the charts. Civilization was one of those games that spread slowly, mainly through word of mouth. It wasn't like Microprose were spending a whole ton of money on advertising the game at first. It still took them a bit of time to realise the big hit that they had on their hands. Great monthly sales soon translated into awards, and ultimately to one of Microprose's biggest hits, coming out at a time when they seriously needed it. Through all the troubles that the game had faced, Sid Meier's vision had been vindicated. The once shy and quiet nerd who Wild Bill had met in that basement arcade all those years ago was now almost a different person, filled with his own steely resolve and plenty of confidence as well. Once again, the loud and shouty jock had to concede that his former partner had had the right idea. It's estimated that as of 2016, the original Civilization has sold 1.5 million copies, with just over half of those coming in the years before the release of the sequel. In the end though, Civilization would only be a temporary fix for Microprose. It'd give them enough money to last a good few more months, but ultimately Black Wednesday in the UK, September 16th, 1992, would basically be a death blow for Microprose. Or at least, it would have been if Wild Bill hadn't managed to strike a deal with Spectrum Holobyte for the sale of the company in the months after. If it hadn't been for Civilization, maybe that deal never happens. Not long after this, Wild Bill moves out of the company, and Sid would also take his work elsewhere, eventually to the formation of Firaxis. Even though the series has always bore his name, the original Civ would for years be the only game in the series that Sid Meier was the lead designer on, with future games handled by the likes of Brian Reynolds, Soren Johnson and John Schaefer. Although Sid would eventually be the lead designer on the stripped down and console-friendly Civilization Revolution in 2008. Sid Meier weirdly is nowadays as much of a brand as he is a games designer, but perhaps that's deserved. It's not like the series would be here without him after all. Bye for now. One of the grandest examples of the power of 4X strategy, not to mention one of the most viral, came from a Redditor named Lyserius, posting in 2012 about his game of Sid Meier's Civilization 2, a then 16-year-old sequel. He'd gone beyond the game's usual end date of 2020, and in doing so had unintentionally created a pure hellscape, a 1700 in-game year endless war that he had been playing for 10 very real years of his life. His communist Celts were locked in an eternal conflict against theocratic Vikings and Americans. Nukes had scarred up the land, peace treaties were bashed out and then immediately broken on the next turn, and global warming had melted the ice caps, leaving nothing but useless tundra. By this stage, the three nations were fighting just to do it, almost. It's not like there were that many resources left, or indeed that many people. Any engineer unit who could potentially start converting tundra to farmland and rebuilding the world would probably find themselves staring down a nuclear missile on the very next turn. Lyserius had somehow managed to create the purest gaming adaptation of George Orwell's 1984. He was hopeful for some kind of solution so that one civilization, ideally his, could be alone in the world and start to rebuild it, and his write-up and inquiries for a solution made it to the front pages of just about every gaming and tech site on the internet. In the end, a combination of spies planting nukes in enemy cities to obliterate long-standing armies inside the walls, and pure-grain fundamentalism to suffocate any Senate's possible quibbles, provided a solution to nearly 2 millennia worth of conflict. To this very day, a dedicated few still talk about, write fanfiction for, and tributes to, the so-called Eternal War. Civilization 2 is one of the greatest sequels, if not one of the greatest games ever made. As it goes, the game's impact on the series it comes from is quite possibly even greater than that of the original title that it spawned from. The original Civ was a revolution all of its own, but Civ 2 was bold enough to make the important fundamental changes that needed to be made, and every Civ since has largely been built from its foundations. As soon as it was released, it was clear that the series was going to be here forever. But even if you might expect that such a game would be a layup, especially considering how successful the first Civilization was, well, naturally that's not the case. Indeed, much like the original, it's a wonder that Civ 2 happened at all. There's a lot to talk about, many new things to break down, from a creator's lack of preciousness about their work, new perspectives brought in due to the boom of the internet, all the way to a parent company in utter crisis that still struggled to truly recognise what they had when they looked at this seemingly not graphically impressive game where a single unit moving from square to square was, in fact, a grand army marching forward and writing another sentence in the chronicles of your empire. The success of the original Civilization turned the quiet yet strong-willed Sid Meier into a household name, in the gaming world at least. His name was right there on the marquee after all. You knew exactly who you could thank for those countless hours and sleepless nights spent in pursuit of that global empire. For all the struggles that the game went through, the wrangling with Microprose's head office and the company's high-flying boss, Wild Bill Steely, to the potential legal struggles with an angered Avalon Hill, Civilization had prevailed. A game that wasn't expected to do all that much on the shelves became one of the biggest hits of the 1990s. More than just Civ itself though, the game was the culmination of an intensely prolific period for the designer that had also resulted in games like F-15 Strike Eagle, Pirates, F-19 Stealth Fighter, and Railroad Tycoon. He hadn't stopped for a decade, and the first order of business after releasing Civ was for Meier to take a well-earned break. All in all, Sid Meier was quite satisfied with his work on Civilization, and as such, well, he didn't have a huge amount of interest in making a sequel. In fact, despite the fact that every Civilization title would bear his name, Sid Meier himself would not return to his own series as the lead designer until 2008, when he headed up the console-geared Civilization Revolution. Generally speaking, he wasn't one for sequels, and had no interest in trying to create something that was even bigger. Between Civ 1 and 2, there was a little project he worked on for the 3DO called CPU Buck, a music-making program that was very much a labour of love, while his classic Pirates was remade for newer computers and brought out again as Pirates Gold, but he didn't have too much to do with that. The main game that he's recognised for between the Civs, one that's very important when it comes to the development of Civ 2 and is, indeed, another famous game in its own right, is of course the game with a very similar title to that of Civilization, Sid Meier's Colonization. Indeed, rather than Civ 2, Colonization would be the start of Sid Meier's name appearing on a game that he actually hadn't served as lead designer on, although he took a far more considerable role in the development of the title than he did for future Civilization titles. Rather, the original idea for the game came from a Berkeley graduate named Brian Reynolds, who'd started working for Microprose at the start of the 90s. He joined a company that was chaotic and on an inexorable decline. For all its success, Sid Meier's Civilization could only do so much to stop that, and the same applied to other strategy games, largely developed on the outside, that the studio threw themselves into. As lauded as they were, games like XCOM and Master of Magic couldn't reverse the company's fortunes. Between the diminishing commercial returns for their main line of military vehicle simulation games, and utter disasters such as their attempt to get into the arcade business, Microprose were facing the wall, and in 1993 they were bought out by Spectrum Holobyte. Holobyte made sweeping cuts and killed various ill-advised ventures the company had tried to establish. One of these was their adventure games team, set up in a haphazard and unsuccessful attempt to compete with LucasArts and Sierra. This was the team that Brian Reynolds belonged to, where he'd programmed on games such as Rex Nebula and the Cosmic Genderbender and Return of the Phantom. The adventure game division of Microprose was dead, but Reynolds had not yet received his cards. He figured that while he was waiting for the inevitable axe to fall, he may as well work on something. a strategy game that used civilization as its building blocks, but with a smaller focus. Instead of creating an empire all of your own from scratch, you're thrust into an already established nation expanding into a new area in competition with others working to build a colonial empire. This project would ultimately become colonization, of course, and soon enough, once people at Microprose got wind of what Reynolds was doing, he was put together with Sid Meier. Meier had no interest in taking the project out of Reynolds' hands. He was after all knee-deep in buck at the time, and he recognised that despite being similar to Civ, and indeed being based off his game's reverse-engineered code, Reynolds' game was very much his own. And so Sid would officially be a design advisor on the game. He did well in this regard, making plenty of important notes and perhaps, you might say, acting as something of a mentor to Reynolds. After all, Reynolds was an enthusiastic player of strategy games and tabletop war games, and certainly a great lover of the original Civ, but this was the first time he'd created a strategy game of his own. The decision to put Sid Meier's name on the game as if he'd been the driving force behind it came from the marketing department. In this way, Meier himself, perversely for a man of such a soft-spoken nature, was becoming something of a brand, even if this meant that anyone who didn't read the small print would believe that he had created the game, and not Brian Reynolds. Colonization sold very well, somewhere in the region of a couple of 100,000, enough to make it an enduring title from the period even if it's not quite as magnificent as the game it spawned from. The game comes with a bit more detail than the original Civ. There's now a lot more micromanagement involved when it comes to settlements, trade routes and the like, rather than them essentially just existing. The trouble with this is that, being as it's shoehorned into an engine and based on a game that deals very much in abstracts and speed, this addition of details and micromanagement can become rather awkward and clunky, especially as the game advances and you have more and more settlements and just general things to deal with. Some also took issue with the game being less open, with only one single aim: to have enough settlements and production in the New World to be able to declare independence by 1800, at which point you have to win a war against your parent nation by 1850. Some thought this single path to victory not just limiting but myopic. It's the American origin story after all, and it basically casts every playable nation, the British, Spanish, French and Dutch, into the role of the British, with not an awful lot of difference between them. Other issues with colonisation are, of course, of a more problematic nature, and it should be said from the outset that these were things very openly discussed at the time. People did take issue with several core parts of the game, or indeed other things that were just flat out excluded. The treatment of Native Americans was criticised. While colonisation is somewhat marketed as a quite open-ended game, the only way to really win it pretty much forces you to subjugate and bring the natives to heel, no matter how well you treat them in the beginning. You kind of need their land and resources, and there's no viable alternative. Some thought all this quite distasteful and didn't really want to interact with this part of the game at all. One could, by way of rebuttal, say that this is a historical simulation of sorts, more so than civilization. However, this is diminished by the game's complete exclusion of slavery. In colonization's world, human bondage just doesn't exist, really. At the very best, it's euphemized, represented in those who wanted to be shipped off to the New World, or in the form of criminals. People argued that colonization couldn't really be called a historical simulation if it whitewashed out something so integral to the colonial period, high school textbook style. Now, at no point were the designers of the game accused of racism or prejudice, but perhaps more a certain blinkeredness. Even if the arguments weren't as common and wide-ranged as they are today, disquiet about colonization, or indeed other similar games that took somewhat awkward, gamified views towards history like Conquest of the New World and Panzer General, were most certainly there, hotly debated in editorials and letters pages. It's worth bringing these things up because, well, this is Brian Reynolds' first strategy game. It has a lot of potential, and also a lot to work on. In the very near future, he will create strategic works of art, games that will not just be utterly engrossing from a gameplay and a fun perspective, but will also weave that gameplay through bold, complex narratives that are more than capable of handling any subject, however difficult. Colonization is most certainly still a good game, one that's not afraid to take a winning formula and change an awful lot about it, creating something new out of the existing material. Bringing up the areas where it doesn't necessarily succeed is not a way to take a PC game from 1994 and cancel it, whatever that bloody word means nowadays. For his part, Sid Meier had some disagreements about the game's design, particularly in how single-minded the game was in its winning objective. But in keeping with his initial approach to colonization, he seceded to the lead designer, something that he did not have to do. Make no mistake, Sid Meier could have pretty much said just one word to the executives at Microprose and he would have taken Reynolds' place. The top table certainly would have rather a proven name like Meier be at the head of the game than a complete unknown like Reynolds. He chose not to do this, and the result is, in many ways, a success. And for Brian Reynolds it would be an integral part of his next step forward. Having been mentored by the man behind Civilization, Reynolds was now about to receive the keys to the kingdom. Sid Meier's colonization came out to a warm reception and decent sales, with viewers generally praising the latest creation from gaming's foremost strategic mastermind, even if he'd actually only advised on it. In contrast, the program that Sid Meier had primarily been working on, CPU Buck for the 3DO, came out to a generally lukewarm reception and quickly sank to obscurity on a dying platform. Still, it was kind of a labour of love for a religious man who adored the music of Bach and played it on the organ at his local church. Up next for Sid Meier was designing a game based on Magic the Gathering, which would eventually be his final game for Microprose. So no, he still had no desire to head up another Civilization game. If the perpetually stumbling Microprose, still floundering under the purview of Spectrum Holobyte, was to reap the financial rewards of another Civ game, they would have to go elsewhere. So, good thing that a guy had just finished being mentored by Sid on his first strategy game, one that he'd created after reverse engineering Civilization's code. Brian Reynolds got the go-ahead to work on a new Civilization game in late 1994. There's very little involvement from Sid this time. Instead, Brian's going to be mainly working with Doug Kaufman and Jeff Briggs. Kaufman was Brian's tag team partner. He'd been with him in Microprose's ill-fated adventure division, and they'd worked together on a game called Dragonsphere. Briggs, aside from being the composer for the original Civilization, was also a designer and programmer who worked with Sid Meier on CPU Buck and its innovative real-time music computer composition system. The game initially was known as Civilization 2000, a title that is, quite close to SimCity 2000. Indeed, Will Wright's game was seen as the proof for Microprose that a more iterative sequel would work, and gave them the impetus to start the ball rolling on a Civilization sequel, which of course would soon be known as Civilization 2. The trio of Reynolds, Kaufman and Briggs already came into the project as big Civilization fans, of course. While Reynolds and Kaufman only came into Microprose just as development on the original was wrapping up, they'd found themselves utterly addicted to the game, and they'd also played plenty of the original Avalon Hill board game as well. They certainly had a fair few ideas of how Civ could be improved based on their many hours of play, and they happily scoured Usenet groups and the like to see what other players were saying and what they would like to see changed. In the end, they had a pretty long list of improvements, changes and fixes to work on. Although they only had a year or so to create the game in, they had more than enough ideas on the board to make Civ 2 a different and worthy sequel. A good chunk of the myriad of changes are set out in Civ 2's lovingly crafted novella of a manual by the team, but there's a few definite big ones. The view switching from top-down to isometric being the most immediately obvious one, allowing for significantly more detailed art and maps without the UI looking too cluttered. Other than that, well, all the big changes are in the gameplay. Civ 2 is a game that does its damnedest to condition you to interact with all of its systems and tries to remove some of the original's stranger foibles. It's the first Civ to introduce the concept of borders between empires, an invisible line that will soon see your troops expelled from another Civ's territory unless you share an alliance with them that can only be circumvented by caravan, explorer, and diplomat spy units. Gone are the days when you could happily surround rival cities with troops before declaring war on your enemy. Now you'll have to think a bit harder about mobilisation. This also guides you towards interacting a lot more with the game's diplomacy system, which had a lot of work put into it. There's a lot more options, and the diplomacy AI is a great deal more advanced. Forms of government and certain wonders can also stop a player from going too gung-ho. Democracy comes with a whole load of benefits in the technological and cultural departments, but a Senate won't just let you go to war with enemies for no reason, and the United Nations will also have a say in the late game. Certainly when it comes to the higher difficulties, there's a lot more planning out to be done, a lot more serious strategy, a lot more playing with a purpose whether you want to paint the world red with the blood of your enemies, or take the first available spaceship off of Earth and towards Alpha Centauri. Now of course you're probably going to be fighting at some point or another, that's just the way of things. And there's been a big load of changes here too, primarily in the introduction of hit points. One of the most famous foibles of the original game was that battles were based on weighted dice rolls, each unit having a chance of victory out of 100 depending on what they were and who they were fighting. A modern battleship would naturally beat an ancient phalanx 99 times out of 100, and yet, well, sometimes the one just comes up, and those 1,000-year-old men armed with naught but spears have just sunk your state-of-the-art war machine. In Civ 2 this pretty much never happens. Little energy bars represent your unit's strength, and generally units take more than one hit to kill. There's also a much more significant distinction between units that are built for attack and those that are better suited to defence, and more consideration towards the terrain that you're fighting on and how far into a turn you choose to attack. Even if you have units that are far more advanced than your enemies, it may be a foolish move to attack a heavily fortified unit at the end of your unit's turn, when they're only operating at a third of their strength. The addition of hit points also means that units aren't immediately back to full strength. The damage they take in battle does last. So after a particularly messy scrap, you may want to consider resting your soldiers up for a bit, either by letting them suck wind on the field by skipping a few turns, or ideally by taking them off to a city that's got a barracks, airport or port facility, depending on what the unit is. These changes are some of the more visible ones, but there's a whole ton more to be found. The makers of Civ 2 wanted to link everything up as much as possible, rather than having all facets of the game exist in their own little world, vastly improving the links between, say, different types of government and the effects that city improvements have. Diplomacy, a rather simple thing in the first Civ game, is now highly complex. Your relations with enemies go through a whole different set of grades rather than simply being at peace or at war. You can now be neutral, you can have a full alliance with a Civ which allows you to move freely through their territories, and you can also negotiate temporary ceasefires that'll put the brakes on a war for 10 turns. No longer are you basically at war with an enemy if you refuse to sign a peace treaty. Also, you now have a reputation to consider. If you're fond of setting up treaties with other civilizations and then breaking them later on, other civs are going to be very wary of doing any business with you. And you can even piss them off if you try and hold meetings with them too much. They may just not want to speak to you at all. The tech tree has been heavily modified so that there are less dead-end technologies. There's a whole lot of rebalancing when it comes to units, adding a lot of new ones that serve to bridge a gap between medieval knights and modern armour, in the words of the manual, while also slightly weakening originally overpowered units like the chariot and strengthening underpowered units like the musketeers. The same applies to wonders. There's several new ones that bring the total up to 28, a lot of the effects have changed, and the two most overpowered wonders from the first game, the pyramids and the SETI program, have been scaled back somewhat. Finally, there's a brand new difficulty level, Deity, an all new hefty challenge for super players. But at the same time, computer AI has been greatly improved across the board and is a whole lot fairer. The computer now actually has to fully build wonders this time around, for example, rather than just getting them during one particular turn. This whole boatload of changes serves to try and make Civilization 2 a more complex and more balanced game than the original, while also not neglecting the things that made Civilization great. There's no desire here to bog the game down in micromanagement, something that Colonization suffered from. I think it certainly helps that this time around, more than one person worked on the game. Whereas Sid Meier was essentially alone on the first game, Civ 2 has a whole group of primary designers and coders. As detailed in the designer's notes, it all started in a roundtable meeting with Sid, Brian and Jeff. There was a great deal of examination of all the best suggestions sent in by fans either through snail mail or on the internet. Brian Reynolds retreated temporarily to the dates of Yorkshire to hammer out the designs and prototypes, and then it all came together with Brian, Jeff and Doug Kaufman going at it. Naturally, this time with the help of a lot more people at Microprose working on QA, multimedia, art and so on. There's other improvements to the game that are worthy of note, as well as some things the team wanted to include but ultimately couldn't. We've not even covered the best and most important of all the improvements yet, in fact. We'll get to that in the next chapter, as we see just what it's like to play Civilization 2 and work on building that glorious empire. Of course, when you start a game of Civ 2, there's other changes that you should take note of pretty quickly. Seeing as this is a CD-ROM game, you have a nice opening intro video and CD quality music. This is but the first signifier of this game being a Civ released slap bang in the glorious era of multimedia, and it won't be the last. And of course you'll have more civilizations to choose from. The original had 14 civilizations, and the second game now has 21. Not only that, but each Civ has 2 different leaders, depending on the gender you've chosen, or the gender the computer has chosen. A monster myriad of usual options available. How big a world do you want? How many rival civs? Pick a difficulty from chieftain up to the new deity. Choose how many barbarians you'd like to have kicking around and so on. You'll find new options based around deciding your civilization's architectural style, as well as being able to load in custom maps, which is something we'll get to soon enough. For now, Civ 2 pretty much starts like any other Civilization game, and a lot of the changes will become apparent as you play and undoubtedly become hooked. As far as the raw appeal goes, not a lot has changed. This is still glorious, beautiful Civilization, as addictive as the first game. Everything that applies to the first game applies to this one. The new fancier graphics just help things along, the experience just as quick as you move settlers around, found a new city, build your first units, gradually uncover what's nearby and search villages in the hope for extra resources. You may get unlucky and unleash some barbarians, but you may also find anything from gold to new technology, an extra unit to an advanced tribe that can become a city. Hopefully you find a good place for your capital. There's plenty more resources to mine after all. If there's a river nearby, you can use it just as you would a road and move units up and down it quicker. Another little yet significant change that's very important in the early game and was actually first introduced in Colonization. So yeah, it's good as ever, really. Whether you've played hundreds of hours of the original Civ, or this was your first Civ game full stop, there's a lot to love about it. The additions, tweaks and improvements, a lot of which we have already discussed, only serve to make it an even better and more engrossing experience. For me personally, this was my first proper PC CD-ROM game bought at a shop in Lakeside, having previously loved the original Civ on Amiga. So there was certainly plenty of familiarity already, even if I'm not necessarily the most skilled Civ player or anything like that. Of course, things like that don't matter all too much with Civ. Every Civilization game is a long, complex story, no matter if it ends in your glorious success over everyone else or an ignoble failure. Right from the start, you've got to make the most of your advantages and recognise where you're lacking. You meet your first few fellow civilizations, take stock of them and see how they're doing, how much of a threat they're going to be and so forth. Perhaps you're sharing space with a genteel King Frederick II of the Germans, or a more immediately hostile Montezuma of the Aztecs. Worst of all, perhaps you've come across Gandhi and you've pissed yourself immediately at seeing the perpetual glint of atomic fire reflecting off his glasses. Who cares if that's just an urban legend? It all gradually becomes clear, and you'll soon need a direct, long-term plan in order to stay ahead. I think one of the strongest areas of Civ 2 compared with the original is how much more it feels like you're playing a game against actual players, which is a big positive for the game's artificial intelligence. You got less of that feeling in the first Civ. There wasn't much you could do in terms of interacting with them, and it really didn't help that they sometimes tended to cheat a bit when it comes to things like wonders. When you think back all the way to Civilization's origins as a board game in the early 1980s, Civ 2 definitely has that feeling of a group of players sitting around a massive board. The tiniest of touches, such as the lists that often come up revealing the wealthiest, biggest or most advanced civilizations in the world, do help with that a bit, giving you just enough insight into how others are doing and where you are in the pecking order. The same applies to new additions like the reputation system and the inclusion of a lot more advice on what you should possibly do next. As in the original, you'll get recommendations on what technology you should research next, or what you should build from both a military and domestic perspective. But there's plenty more interaction with the game this time around. It's very welcome, and immerses you further into this grand game while also helping you become better at it. Which of course leads us straight into the game's greatest and most important addition. Something that not only cemented Civ 2 as a great game, but one that would keep it wholly relevant and active for many years to come. I am of course talking about the High Council. What a glorious thing! Whenever you like, you can call them up and watch grainy videos where actors dressed in costumes tell you what to do. The bold military advisor waves his knife around as he demands more soldiers. The nerdy science advisor thinks it's all going okay, but perhaps the science rate should be raised just a little. You've mostly taken the military advisor's side, the river's one red with blood, and the yuppie trade advisor is horrified that you haven't even frickin' discovered trade yet. Our vaguely Eastern European foreign advisor thinks everything's going great, and is waiting for you to give orders to our spies so that they can start installing some atomic improvements in our enemies' cities. And if you play the game at all like I do, the attitude advisor who's dressed as Elvis is perpetually glum because the luxuries rate is firmly rooted at 0%. Who needs happiness when you've got technology and money? Ah, what a glorious thing. Okay, perhaps it's not the greatest and most important addition to Civilization 2. It's a silly little bit of multimedia fun, along with the various wonder videos that you get whenever you successfully build a big project, and the throne room. It's very much of the era when no PC game or educational software could be shipped without a cache of low-quality .mov files, but it continues to be quite the laugh. It's especially great when you go and consult them during the period of anarchy you get when you change a government, and are immediately greeted with a cacophony of howls of outrage and wails into the ether. Lovely stuff.
Who knew this was going to happen? I knew this was going to happen. You cannot listen to these.
There will be no more gods, women will...
So, what is Civilization 2's most important improvement over the original? For real this time. It's right there in plain sight actually. The little menu option between World and Civilopedia marked Cheat. Yes, you can, if you wish, cheat to your heart's content. Once you enable cheat mode, you can do anything. Spawn all the units, research all the tech, build cities at the click of a button, even change the terrain of the world completely using the map editor. On the entirely superficial side of things, this allows you to let off steam and have some silly fun with your game. Sometimes it's just a laugh to spawn a few helicopters before you've even done so much as discovered alphabet. Has the ruler of a local civ turned down your offer of a few nuggets of gold in exchange for his knowledge of code of laws? Make him pay by sticking a few cruise missiles next to his huts. That'll learn him. Sure is easy to win when God's on your side, isn't it? So yes, you can use the cheat menu, quite simply, to cheat. However, the cheat menu has a far greater purpose. It's there so that you can modify your game of Civ 2 to your will. It's a full-on editor that allows you to basically change everything. To build a new map, to stick terrain and art in that you've created, to construct entirely new civilizations with their own characteristics, to conjure up brand new technologies, units and city improvements. To build scenarios. This, folks, is the big addition to Civilization 2, the one that's going to cement its place in the PC world for the rest of time. Of all the additions to Civilization 2, This godlike power was the one that Sid Meier had the most misgivings about. He was a little concerned about giving so much power to the player over the game to allow them this ability to basically do as they wish to it. But he'd come around on it soon enough. And, well, why not? In a way, this is how Brian Reynolds got started. He took the original civilization and heavily modified it, creating colonization in the process. And now, Brian Reynolds is making it easy for you to do it. The original game comes with a couple of sample scenarios as standard, one based on World War II and another concentrating on the rise of Rome, but the rest, well, it's up to you and your imagination. Needless to say, people responded to it immediately. They created scenarios and distributed them amongst each other all over the internet. They still do to this day, in fact. Just search Civ 2 scenarios and you'll find so many examples, some that are based on 20th century wars and various other historic battles, some that are deep dives into the what-ifs of alternate history, some that are complete flights of futuristic fantasy where you might well forget that you're actually playing Civilization 2. When people talk about how great Civ 2 is, the scenarios should pretty much be the first thing on the list. The game was so bold as to stick the ability to modify it right there at the front, available with a single click. A true sandbox, and one whose influence is quite frankly incalculable as a result. Civilization 2 hands heavy over just about every other grand strategy game released after it, not to mention many games in other genres. Right there at the boom of modding, up there with the FPS titles, the Dooms and all of that. People were certainly able to do this sort of thing before, perhaps, but the games were never quite so yielding and so willing to let you play around with its inner workings. With Civ 2, modding a game is basically thrust open to anyone who's got an idea, with a dead simple system that takes nothing except actually playing the game to learn. It may not have even been the main reason why people adored the game at the time, perhaps, but now, 25 years later, there are still people creating for Civilization 2, and there probably always will be. Despite all the great Civilization games that have come after, a whole lot of people still play this one, as evidenced by that anecdote at the very start. Still, we should look more at the immediate reaction to Civ 2, how scenarios would become the key selling point of the game's expansions, and the circumstances behind Civilization's core team deciding that they'd had enough of microprose and that they were going to strike out on their own. So as you might have guessed, Civilization 2 was a pretty significant success. One of the best-selling games of 1996, it was pretty much never out of the charts that year, and in fact was still kicking around in the upper reaches in 1997 and 1998. Jeff Briggs estimated in 2001 that the game had sold around about 3 million, mostly on PC, although there had also been perfectly okay sales for the game's acceptable if somewhat hamstrung PlayStation port. The reviews, as you might expect, were outstanding across the board. It was immediately proclaimed one of the greatest PC games of all time. As far as honours from websites go, IGN did go as far as to rank it the third greatest game quite literally ever in 2007. And hey, whether it's IGN or not, that's pretty bloody decent going. And despite all of this, it would be the last game Brian Reynolds and Jeff Briggs made for Microprose. Only a few months after the release of the game, the pair, and Sid Meier, announced that they were leaving the company and founding a new studio, Firaxis Games. What brought this on then? Well, the trio had found themselves increasingly unhappy with the management at Microprose, particularly after the takeover by Spectrum Holobyte. It seems as though the work they were doing wasn't really taken particularly seriously. That despite the huge success of the first Civilization, the parent company didn't necessarily think that its success was going to be repeated. Now this had in a way been something of a blessing. It had meant that there wasn't an awful lot of managerial supervision on Civ 2, the game was largely worked on without any interference, and the team were able to make a lot of rather significant changes that weren't particularly questioned. Still, it also felt somewhat galling, seeing as a situation had kind of developed in which the Civ team at Microprose found themselves in direct competition with the management at Microprose. Believe it or not, Microprose, and by extension Spectrum Holobyte, were actually extremely confident that sales of CivNet, released in 1995, would far outstrip the sales of Civilization 2. CivNet was something of a thorn in the side of the Civ 2 team, and of Sid Meier. It didn't have an awful lot to do with any of them, and wasn't exactly too much except Civilization, but with the addition of online multiplayer. In fact, Reynolds and company had hoped to add online multiplayer to Civilization 2. They couldn't, and part of the reason for that was down to CivNet. And CivNet? Well, it got lukewarm reviews and kind of sank to obscurity pretty quickly. Aside from the online multiplayer and the addition of a world editor, it was basically just a pure re-release of Civilization, and fans rejected it in favour of Civ 2, which was released only a few months later. Even if Civ 2 didn't have any online multiplayer, its release immediately consigned CivNet to the bargain bin. And just like the original game, even if it never actually topped the monthly sales charts, its sales would just run and run and run. An evergreen title that sold very well, month after month, for a good few years. And so the ever-ailing Microprose no longer has the Civ guys on their books, meaning that they no longer have the guy who was pretty much their leading brand now either. They've all buggered off to form Firaxis and largely work with EA. They do still have Civilization on the books, mind you, and the game will enjoy a couple of expansions. The best of these naturally are the ones which concentrate on scenarios. Conflicts in Civilization and Fantastic Worlds bring some of the best scenarios available together on CD-ROM, with all the different takes you might expect. For many, the most memorable of these is the scenario in Fantastic Worlds that's basically Civilization 2 meets XCOM, although others are based on both Master of Magic and Master of Orion. Then of course there are the other Meteor expansions and re-releases. The Multiplayer Gold Edition does, as you might expect, add network multiplayer and hotshot features, very welcome of course. However, it also tweaks the AI and makes it far more aggressive, which does kind of spoil a lot of the careful diplomacy. And then there's Test of Time, which is, well, it's almost a complete overhaul. New interface, new animations. Geez, you could almost think that it was a new bloody game. It's not so much a large expansion as it is a damn near total remake, and therefore it requires a bit more explanation and context. That being a look at the messy fight between games companies, which saw several different studios putting out games called Civilization in the late 90s. Without getting too deep into the legalese, it appears as though Avalon Hill really wanted some proper meaty pounds of flesh over the whole Civilization issue. The one that had angered them greatly in the first place when the original Civ came out, and they found that it was in many ways quite similar to the tabletop game they published. In 1997, with the company struggling financially, they decided to get into bed with Bobby Kotick's Activision, selling them the rights to the Civilization name. A few months later, Activision and Avalon Hill sued Microprose with the aim of getting Civ 2 off the shelves. Avalon Hill claimed that their initial agreement with Microprose only extended to the first game and no others. In response, Microprose bought Heartland Trefoil, the small British board game company owned by Francis Tresham, the original creator and seller of Civilization, before the game had been brought to America by Avalon Hill. Doing this, Microprose believed, gave them exclusive rights to Civilization in both computer game and board game form, and they immediately countersued. The main reason why Activision and Avalon Hill worked together on this, presumably, was to sweep the board clean and make a path for Activision's Civ game, Civilization Call to Power, which was eventually released in April of 1999. The legal dispute was quite clearly one that was going to take years upon years to be hammered out, and so the two sides reached an out-of-court settlement in early '99. By this stage, the wheels had been set in motion for Hasbro to buy up both Avalon Hill and Microprose, so it didn't matter an awful lot anymore. Still, Microprose released Civilization 2 Test of Time in July of 1999 as something of a response. Most of the changes are purely cosmetic in nature, and reviews were a little middling, although it does have something of a legacy in that it is what the later Free Civ was based on. And let's not forget that through all of this, you had Firaxis' Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri. Alpha Centauri was released in February 1999 with Brian Reynolds at the helm. is essentially the real continuation of the Civilization line in the eyes of most people. Neither Call to Power or Test of Time can hold a candle to it, and chances are we'll probably be doing an entire video about it at some point because it's one of the best games ever made. Still, there are some odd quirks, particularly about Call to Power, that might have had a bit of influence on the lineage, even if back then when more people saw it as part of the main series, despite not having anything to do with any Civ creator and indeed being made by a different company, it was seen as a bit of a disappointment. And yes, the whole thing can be rather confusing. Amusingly enough, thinking back to the troubles that surrounded colonisation, it's the first Civ game to include slavery, in the form of slaver units that can take the populations away from your city, as well as their natural enemy, liberators. It's also the first Civ game to really start playing with religion, again in the form of the cleric or televangelist unit, which can be used in a similar vein to a diplomat or spy, corrupting an enemy's city but in a different way. Religion's not going to be a major facet of any Civ game until much later, so even if Call to Power 1 and 2, the second one didn't have the Civilization name on it at all, were perhaps playing with these things in slightly crude ways, it was a bit ahead of the curve in this regard. The games do still have small yet dedicated pockets of fans in the Civilization community to this day, and they are just about accepted as official Civ games of a sort. For all that they could easily be bloody terrible, miserable, blatant copies, they're not actually all that bad. And, well, I think it's a good idea to draw a line here. With the sale of Microprose to Hasbro in April 1999, and then later the sale of Hasbro Interactive to Infogrames in the early 2000s, the Civilization brand eventually ends up back under the guard of Firaxis when Infogrames decides to work with them and produce Civilization 3. Naturally, Firaxis are still in charge of the game now, even though Infogrames eventually sold the Civ brand to 2K Games in the mid-noughties. There's a possibility that we might look at all of this in another video somewhere further down the line, but whenever there is a next video about Civilization, well, as I said already, I think you know what game that's going to cover, and it sure as hell isn't Civilization 3. That's not the next video or anything, but, well, someday. But all that's left is to ask you to bring me more soldiers so that I may bathe in the beating hearts of my enemies, and to wish you all a thoroughly pleasant bye for now. The first time I asked the question in the title of this video, I was talking about Half-Life. Now the video did good, but the answer to the question from the comments was quite clearly, like, yes, obviously it is. Also, why the hell are you playing it with a controller, you utter plonker? Still, it was good bait. However, today I have a game where said question might be a bit more worthwhile to ask. A game that in many's eyes invented and codified an entire subgenre, a subgenre that's still sort of around today. One of the best known games of all time, and certainly one of the most ported. It's Prince of Persia. Now I've talked about Prince of Persia a fair bit. Weirdly enough, if you want to look behind the scenes at the game, you may want to check out my flashback video where I went into Jordan Mechner's previous history with Karateka, the rotoscoping that he did for the animation, all of that. It's difficult to talk about any major cinematic platformer without giving Prince of Persia the recognition it's due, as none of them would exist without it. And yet, I've not actually ever gone into much detail about the game itself. I've only ever looked at that from a surface level. And even if cinematic platformers aren't a genre that's seen that much these days, a lot of them have held up pretty well still. So I thought that the best angle to approach this, such a revered game, is to examine how actually fun it is to play in 2018. So, let's go! Well, actually let's not. The first question is, what's the best platform to actually play the game on? Prince of Persia has a ludicrous amount of ports, both official and unofficial, and the quality of them varies wildly. Obviously there's a lot of official ports for major consoles and computers, starting with the Apple II original and moving on to the first port, which was to the Amiga in 1990. From there, well, You can find Prince of Persia in many places where you wouldn't necessarily expect it. The Amstrad CPC had an official port of the game, but the Spectrum and C64 did not. The Amstrad version isn't actually that bad technically. I do believe it's only playable on CPC Plus models, mind you. With that in mind, it's a wonder that it didn't make it to the good old GX4000, but alas it did not. The worldwide appeal of the game is shown by various ports to Japanese machines. The PC 9801, Sharpex 68000 and Fujitsu FM Towns all received popular ports, with the FM Towns version notably featuring Redbook audio. But as far as obscure computer ports go, these machines are practically the Beatles compared to the SAM Coupe. The SAM is a variant, some would say an unofficial upgrade, of the Spectrum from 1989 that sold all of 12,000 units. The similarity to the Spectrum was such that Specky Mags of the day welcomed it and even covered it, but it wasn't successful. And yet you can play Prince of Persia on it. Work was already in progress on it, the coders reached out to Broderbund just for the hell of it, and were pretty shocked when they gave it the official nod. All things considered, the port is solid. Basically everything's there. Sound effects are a bit weird though. Things get even more obscure if you look at unofficial computer ports. There's the Enterprise 128, a UK-made Z80 machine which attracted a following in Hungary of all places. Someone's made POP for that. The Soviet Union-made Electronica BK and ATM Turbo also received unofficial ports. In 1998, someone made a demo of the game for the Hewlett-Packard 48GX calculator, and as recently as this year, a man named Kieran has made a version of the game for the BBC Master. Needless to say, there's lots of ways to play the game, from modern remakes to all kinds of ports for what seems like any even remotely significant computer and console, plus handheld versions for the Game Boy, Game Gear and Game Boy Color. That port came out in 1999. So, well, what do we play? Well, let's keep it simple. I prefer to keep my Prince of Persia largely as it was originally intended. The Mega Drive and SNES versions have nice graphics, but they kind of screw around with the controls which, as will be seen, makes the game even harder to play than it already is. I'd rather play a version that's pretty close to the original while having a bit of a nice sheen on it, and so, as you might expect, I'm going with the Amiga. It, the ST and the DOS version were the original ports, and they're still the best of them, the ones that really made Prince of Persia the legend it was to become. This is one of those games that just works better with a single button and directions, honestly. So, now, let's get to it. In case you don't know, the Grand Vizier Jafar has kidnapped the Sultan's daughter and has given her an hour to marry him or die. You, as the prince, must travel through 12 levels, from the dungeons all the way up to the palace tower, navigating traps and battling guards every step of the way. There's no lives as such, just the timer. Any death results in you starting a level from scratch, with the hourglass continuing its endless trickle down to zero. Considering how big and tough some of these levels can be, deaths can often be quite punishing. The big thing about this, and most other cinematic platformers, is realistic movement. There's momentum in everything, and you can hardly stop on a sixpence. You can only take a big jump if you have enough space to run first, and you have to climb up to ledges often. Basically, you're playing as a very athletic man, but a man you are, so there's limitations on what you can do. You certainly can't fall that far, and you certainly won't be running everywhere. A lot of times you'll have to slowly edge forward, either to get on the edge of a platform in order to line up a jump, or to slowly get past a spike trap that'll kill you if you run at it. This isn't a game about reflexes, it's much more meticulous and planned out. How well do these controls work today then? Well, I have to admit that in this department, I do struggle a lot with Prince of Persia. There's a certain jerkiness to it that makes it tough to control right. There's times when you miss jumps even though you seemingly press the button well before you reach the edge, and that usually means death. It's very finicky. Weirdly, I find this to be even more true of the later versions on consoles, which are usually worse because the controls are pretty awkwardly mapped, especially in the Mega Drive game, which seemingly just assigns various actions at random. At least a single button makes it simple. But there is another thing that I've never liked about the game: the sword fighting. I just find it quite annoying. So often you do something that's clearly a hit and yet it doesn't register, or you pressed to parry half an hour ago but it doesn't happen and you get hit anyway, and the fights are basically always the same. One thing that's notable about a lot of other cinematic platformers, how many of them featured close range or hand-to-hand combat? Not many. To be honest, I think Prince of Persia kinda shows why a lot of the other cinematic games opted for ranged weapons. With all the animation around and the slow pace, close fighting just kinda feels very awkward. As a fan of the genre, naturally you can't help compare this game to the ones that came after, and even though they all follow the template which POP created, I tend to find them a bit more forgiving in the control department. Maybe because the animation's a bit more fluid, maybe because for me POP does one that little bit jerky and fast. Those seem to be the likeliest explanations. Of course, these games have plenty more in common with the original than just controls, which leads me into the whole design of Prince of Persia itself. Cinematic platformers are quite often very trial and error. You have to find the precise way for a situation, and usually the way to that solution is scattered with the corpses of failed attempts. You get used to sneaking quietly into the next unknown screen because usually if you run in, you won't have time to react to the jump or the trap, and then you'll be dead. Some games are a bit more forgiving in this department. Another World is extremely difficult, but it also has frequent checkpoints and infinite continues, plus it's a pretty short game to begin with. Flashback is quite punishing, a death can mean going back to the start of a level, and the levels are long. However, there are also a fair few save points which you can use, which allow you to restart mid-level if things go wrong. Prince of Persia? Easily the most punishing of them all. No saves, and all deaths take you back to the start. Enough deaths will simply make the game unwinnable. You only have an hour after all. For me, this can make Prince of Persia feel like a bit of a slog. Essentially, it's all about developing a memory for every stage and knowing how to get through them. And even then you can still fall foul of a sword fight or the controls if you aren't careful. Of course these things do get better with practice for most people. For me they're things I've never been able to grasp, but perhaps that's just me being rubbish. There isn't a lot of variation in the game either, which is perhaps to be expected. It was, after all, the first. The fights, jumps and puzzles can get a bit samey pretty quickly, and usually when I play this game I do have to say it's not long before I fancy playing something similar that changes things up a bit more. Now all this makes me sound as though I really don't like Prince of Persia, but there are things that still entice me. You might expect me to say that the graphics aren't much to shout about. Prince of Persia is all bricks and mortar, whereas say Flashback is filled with alien worlds. But I've always appreciated how clean this game looks. It's not eye-catching, but it's utterly serviceable and consistent. And the animation is still pretty gorgeous, even if the game's nearly 30 years old. I find that looks-wise the original still has a lot to shout about, even when compared to later efforts that tried to add to the graphics, but in the end added a bunch of things that the game just didn't really need. The cinematic presentation and sound still holds up nicely too, an evolution of the already good stuff that was in Jordan Mechner's previous game, Karateka. I still think that aesthetically, Prince of Persia is a very nice game. Now with all these main bases covered, there are still some other angles to take this from. What about modern improvements? Some old games may be tough, but some might find them highly improved by, for example, using save states or rewinds in an emulator. Kid Chameleon is a good example, a game that's way too freaking long and has no passwords or anything. It's better if you just use save states to come back to it when you want another blast. You can do this with Prince of Persia of course, but is that a satisfying way to play? I mean, it's not that long a game, not one that's really meant for multiple sittings. If you use save states, you turn an extremely difficult game to one that pretty much has zero challenge. You'll beat it in the end, and you won't need to worry at all about the timer. So in this instance, I'm not sure if doing such things makes the game any better really. Kinda the opposite. Save states and the like are worth it if the game still retains the satisfaction of beating it, and as long as you can exercise some discipline. And while I've never beaten this game because I'm admittedly pants at it, I can't say that cheesing it makes it any better. But then, well, maybe it actually does. Because there's one thing about Prince of Persia that's still stronger than ever, its narrative drive. I do the game a pretty intense disservice by reducing it merely to a bunch of jumps and sword fights. There's so much more to it than that. Even now, playing Prince of Persia, it's still easy to see why the game was such a revelation, and why it was treated like such a groundbreaking game. Jordan Mechner managed to spin a complex little narrative, full of twists and turns, with almost zero words. Karateka was the template here, of course, but POP was the full one. It's not half surprising when the game suddenly gets supernatural, the fight with the skeleton, the reveal of your doppelganger who then leaves you no option but to plunge down a hole into the next level, the potion that lets you glide down. There's all these different story beats at a time when most non-RPG games were still jump on monster. This is one thing about POP that reverberates through the ages, not just amongst the games immediately influenced by it, but ones that came decades later. And awkward controls still can't diminish that pull. It's like a bloody good romp of a silent movie, which, considering the sort of films that influenced it, is actually thoroughly appropriate. So, is this game still worth playing in the year of our Lord 2018, current year? I ask this question not to diminish the game's achievements, of course. Prince of Persia is a stone-cold classic, one of the most influential games ever, and a game that will forever live on, way after this channel's dead and gone, that's for sure. For me, the game was improved upon by others. It still took a while to perfect the formula that this game created. I mean, if I'm honest, I find it a struggle to play Another World nowadays as well. But once Flashback, Blackthorn and the like came out, even back then it became a bit hard to go all the way back to Prince of Persia. Some would also point to the game's sequel, The Shadow and the Flame, as another title that improved further upon the original's template. Prince of Persia did get left a little behind in the end, and I think if you want to find the definitive example of a cinematic platform and see just what the genre's about, maybe you'd be better off playing either the sequel or Flashback or something like that. And yet obviously people have always found worth in it, hence the fantastic revival of the franchise in the early 2000s, or that film, or the fact that to this day people are still coding versions of the game for just about every platform out there. Even if the actual play may not be the best nowadays, there's still many things that make this game relevant that just can't be ignored. Bye for now. You may recall that I covered Cinemaware a few weeks back, a trailblazing Amiga developer that tried to make games that were more driven by narrative than gameplay. Even if some said that their games were shallow, they still cut a path different from virtually anyone else at the time, and were certainly influential, not just in the future, but back when they were around. Now of course, it's easy to say that a company was influential without actually providing proof of it, but today we have a game that does just that, one highly inspired by Cinemaware's model that at one point may have even ended up being released by them. That game is a dark classic from the days of the Amiga and the ST, a war game with a pretty hefty message indeed. Today, we are looking at Lost Patrol from 1990. Lost Patrol takes us back to one of the most controversial conflicts of the modern age, Vietnam. The Vietnam War is still a pretty touchy subject even today, and even now you won't find all that many games which cover it. The ones that do usually have a much darker edge than your average gun-ho shooter, which is certainly appropriate. And Lost Patrol certainly doesn't shy away from the darkness. This isn't a shooter, a real-time strategy game or anything like that. It's a game of survival. The original concept from Ian Harlin was a game set in the conflict in the Cinemaware mode, but with more gameplay. There would be minigames, but they would be much more involved and varied. Harlin shopped the concept around to various companies, including Cinemaware themselves, who unfortunately turned it down. Ultimately though, the game was accepted by Ocean Software, with Gary Bracey, Ocean's brilliant software manager, giving it the nod. So, why Ocean? Several reasons perhaps. The most direct one was that they'd already published a licensed game based on Platoon. Now you may well wonder how such a brutal and agonising film got a computer game tie-in. It's hardly one filled with action heroes after all. and yet the game was both a critical and commercial success for the company. Another way of looking at it is by examining some of their older games which did have something of a penchant for both narrative drive and survival, the likes of The Great Escape and the fascinating Where Time Stood Still. Lost Patrol, like those games, does fit right into the evolution of the survival game genre. Still, for Ocean, the idea of making a Platoon 2, essentially, was the main motivation, and it was one that somewhat clashed with the intentions of Ian Harlin and Simon Cook, the designer, artist and coder of the game respectively. As Harlin fleshed the project out, the Vietnam War became an obsession. If he wasn't in the library reading books on the conflict or drawing the art for the game, he was watching Vietnam War movies. On the other hand, as related by Harlin himself, this is around the time that Ocean, transitioning to the 16-bit platforms, had utterly figured out their formula for successful licensed games. They wanted Lost Patrol to be a more action-based title that could fit alongside not just the original Platoon, but the likes of Batman and Navy SEALs. There was something of a clash there, to be sure. And yet, despite that clash, the designers ultimately had their way. Lost Patrol evolved from a Cinemaware-esque title into one with a highly serious narrative, complete with difficult moral choices and a lot of references to various aspects of the conflict, an attempt to accurately and emotionally convey the feel of trekking and fighting in that jungle. Ocean were right to let the duo do what they wanted. Lost Patrol was ultimately a very successful game, not to mention a critical smash that to this day is still remembered as one of the most unique war games you can find. Which now leaves us to simply examine just what it's all about and see if it's still worth playing. The year is 1966, and a helicopter filled with US troops is returning from some rest and relaxation in Saigon. But these troops are about to be brought back in with a bang. The helicopter crashes in the Central Highlands, right in the heart of Viet Cong territory. 7 soldiers survive the crash, albeit with some injuries, randomly set at the beginning of each game, and with limited ammo and food, they will have to complete a 58-mile trek to Du Hoc, the nearest US military outpost. You play as Sergeant Charlie Weaver, who has taken the command of the Lost Patrol, and it's up to you to bring them all to safety. Most of your decisions are made here, in the main map screen. The squad are represented by a little cross near the downed helicopter on the left. At any time you can check your men and get a rough recon of the immediate area in front. You control movement via the compass, click the centre of it and you can choose whether to progress normally, with extreme caution, or march double time. Other options include setting traps with grenades and claymores, controlling the distribution of rations, searching the area and, very important, resting and digging in. It is imperative that you keep the soldiers as well rested as possible. If you push them too hard, then they will lose morale. If they lose too much morale, then they could question your leadership, they could desert you, or worse still, they could even kill you if you're that bad a leader. Each movement takes roughly 20 minutes or so, and it's often best to be consistent at least. 20 minutes rest for every 40 minutes of movement, perhaps. You may be in constant danger, but don't overwork your squad. Your life depends on it. Speaking of life, you'll inevitably be fighting for it against the Viet Cong. You'll run into them soon enough, and this is where you get the minigames. There's several of them, and most of them are good. There's a game where you man a machine gun against a VC patrol, one where you take part in a sniper battle, hand-to-hand combat with a lone troop, fishing out a machine gun nest with grenades, and trying to get past a minefield, crawling and stabbing the ground every step of the way. These minigames are never not tough, especially the VC patrol game, because ammo is very limited. If you run out of bullets, you're going to have to retreat, and during that retreat, it's likely that one of the crew is going to get shot. One false move can be disastrous. Letting a grenade into your nest, for example, is a guaranteed way for your entire squad to be maimed or killed. A soldier killed in action will be remembered, and the game will carry on without him, but if Sergeant Weaver dies at any point, then the game is over. Needless to say, death can come to you in many different ways. There is a certain cruelty and unfair nature to Lost Patrol. Things could be going so well, you could be making progress with a squad that's still relatively healthy, and then all of a sudden, Weaver steps on a booby trap and gets blown to bits. Game over. Bad luck? Well, there are ways to at least try to make your own luck. In the main, making the most out of your squad. The platoon isn't just a bunch of random goons who essentially act as extra lives, they all have certain skills that come in handy. Gomez, for example, is a fantastic point man. Put him as lead or scout and you'll have a much better chance of actually finding the booby traps before they kill you. Buckman is an expert marksman and Blom is a trained martial artist, making them invaluable for the sniper and hand-to-hand sections respectively. There is a certain area where the game gets very platoon indeed though, when you encounter other people, or indeed villagers. These are marked on your map, and when you get there a whole bunch of things can happen. I mean, if you want to roleplay as Sergeant Barnes, then you can make that choice. Scorch the earth, wipe out an entire village. Yes, it's a moral choice that is basically, will you do this extremely horrible thing or will you not? But you didn't get a lot of this in 1989. Actually exploring or interrogating can bring about different scenarios, mind. Hey, maybe you might be invited to stay the night and the lady of the village will cook you a comforting bowl of pho, restoring your health and morale. There is, however, a chance that the bowl of pho is poisoned, killing your entire squad. Or you push the villagers too far with your interrogation, suddenly a young man shoots one of your squad dead, and before you know it the rest of the platoon retaliates and in minutes, the entire population of the village is dead. There are possible benefits to the villagers, such as finding ammo and rations, but there's a risk. You may choose to ignore them entirely and try to find supplies as you go. Don't forget to search the area after you've completed any of the minigames against the VC. There's a lot to say about the presentation too, even if most of the game is spent looking at a map. In Cinemaware style, your progress is interspersed with a lot of evocative drawings and animations, all created by Ian Harlin in good old Deluxe Paint 2. There's also the odd little bit of digitised footage of the war itself, created using a program called Amiga. But if there's one thing that's going to keep you going through the game, it's the music. This sombre creation, all driving bassline and ominous pad synth, is one of the all-time great Amiga songs, one of the best songs you'll find in any war game, right up there with Narcissus from Cannon Fodder. Depressive as it is, it's weirdly catchy too. It probably won't leave your head for a long time after. The song was created by Chris Glaister, who at the time was all of 16 years old and ultimately decided against a career in video game music. A one-hit wonder perhaps, but what a hit. With a game like this though, I can only talk about these core elements so much. The best way perhaps to describe Lost Patrol is through telling the story of how close I came to do Hock and how it all played out. I wanted to get there quickly, so I immediately set the squad to double march, trek for 30 minutes, then rest for 10, and so on. Somewhere near the first village, Blom defeats a soldier in a fistfight, but he takes quite a bit of damage and is never really the same afterwards. We carry on, however. In the first village we question the natives, and they tell us they have no supplies, but Gomez is small enough to fit into a tunnel that's full of them. A more forceful interrogation reveals food and ammo, and we leave without harming anyone. At this point we should be good for food and ammunition for the rest of the journey. The journey continues, but Blom gets ever weaker, and soon Moore takes heavy damage in another fistfight. Every mile saps more strength out of them. Still, we defeat the VC in all encounters. Case's sniping and Gomez's grenades deal with nests, and we suffer minimal damage at the hands of their patrols. But in a sense the damage has already been done. 2 of our squad members are seriously hurt. Other encounters with natives produce little except VC ambushes and an interrogation against frightened ricefield workers that results in little but a handful of grains. As we get into the 4th day, the troops get ever more restless. They start to complain. Kane is the first to do so. Weary and having taken a bullet, he openly complains about Weaver's leadership having a serious effect on morale. This does not last long. Weaver takes the decision to make him a scout, and soon after he succumbs to a Viet Cong soldier in a fight. Weaver almost feels relieved, but this will not last for long. Kane's complaining and subsequent death sends morale on an irreversible downslide. As we trek through the jungle, it too becomes clear that Moore is not going to make it. He is feverish, his wounds are nagging, he is on his last legs. A dying curse slips from his lips as he too curses Weaver's long death march before finally he breathes his last. The platoon is now down to 5. Weaver, at this point only, decides to decrease the pace, but after over 35 miles of relentless double-time marching, the decision has come way too late. Case is the only soldier even vaguely loyal to him. For the rest, talk of mutiny is open, with Buckman simply taking Kane's place as Weaver's head detractor. Blom is the next to go. Even he, with his combat experience but in a highly weakened state, could not withstand another fight with a rabid VC soldier. The only hope that Weaver has may lie in a nearby village that could possibly be friendly, that could allow for a decent night's rest, and may well give the remaining soldiers the energy for one last push towards Du Hoc. But it is not to be. Gomez has had enough. Suddenly he decides to sit on the trail, refusing to move, and the only thing that can be done is to leave him behind. Madness begins to set in as the squad leader loses control. Within sight of the village, the remaining soldiers openly rebel against Weaver's leadership, refusing to do so much as follow his directions and taking their own path. In doing so, the squad is led into a minefield surrounding the village. So much for a friendly welcome. As if that's not enough, a Viet Cong patrol ambushes the sorry horde. Weaver takes a last stand, mounting the gun and giving it all that he's got, soldier after soldier falling in front of him. It is a Herculean effort, and ultimately the Cong retreat. Weaver returns to his group, only to find that none are left. Both Buckman and Case are dead. Was it the minefield? Was it the ambush? Who even knows at this point? Weaver attempts to go it alone, knowing how close he is to the outpost, but the jungle proves too much. No one is left to carry the weight along with him. He becomes delirious, he falls into a sleep from which he never awakened. And so ends the story of the Lost Patrol. So there it is, as close as I came. What could I have done differently? Well, perhaps it was a mistake to overwork the group and go straight into double march. I'd hoped to counterbalance that with frequent resting, but it wasn't enough. When Blom and Moore got seriously injured, our pace slowed considerably, so we had all the drawbacks of double marching, but none of the benefits. The victories in those fistfights proved to be Pyrrhic, and as they both degraded, well, so did the morale of the group. And at the end, perhaps it was a mistake to divert and try for that village. It may have been best to just go for broke and cut a straight path towards Du Hoc as quick as we possibly could. Maybe we wouldn't have hit the minefield that ultimately proved to be our undoing. Would we have made it? Well, woulda, shoulda, coulda. Maybe, maybe not. Perhaps likely not. In Lost Patrol you can have a perfectly good plan in place, and you can make it far, but the tiniest thing can cause it to ever so slowly unravel. Such is the nature of the beast. In summary, playing Lost Patrol is quite the humbling experience. This isn't a game you can expect to breeze through. In all of a second, this game can end. And when you die, a helmet perched on the top of a rifle will be all that remains. 'Cause, you know, war is hell. The people behind this game spent Lord knows how long learning about both the war itself and the cinematic interpretations of it, and it really did come out strongly in the final product. There's a powerful message, a reminder to take care and support those who served and went through not just this conflict, but all conflicts, one that's still very relevant today. Lost Patrol takes a subject and an event that can be hard for games to approach, and creates a powerful piece of software. It rightly deserves a place amongst the classics of the Amiga and ST. Bluntly put, they just don't make them like this anymore. Bye for now. Back in 1989, if you asked most regular people what a computer game was, they'd probably say it was something that beeped a lot. Something that those pesky kids spent way too much time on. Something that probably involved a little yellow pizza looking thing or a fat Italian plumber. The word Nintendo would probably be used a great deal, even for things that aren't by Nintendo. There'd probably already be nostalgic anecdotes about spending a lot of time playing Space Invaders or Pong or whatever, at least until they grew up and grew out of it all. The stereotypes of what a game was were already in place by the end of 1980s, and the general view of what a game was could be generously described as narrow. But in 1989, a game was to come along and break into the mainstream that would completely change those ideas of just what a game could be for a lot of people. A game that was completely different to anything that came before, a game that made the mainstream realise there was a lot more to this than just beeps and boops. a game called SimCity. SimCity was, of course, pretty far from the first game to not be an action or arcade title or something set in a fantasy land or whatever. There were others, certainly in the world of computers, but no game before it had this sort of impact, an eruption that, in its wake, created and popularised an entirely new genre all in one go. SimCity redefined the idea of a computer or video game for many people both inside the industry and outside of it, providing a fountain of inspiration almost incalculable in magnitude. But the road there was hardly a straightforward one. As with a lot of stories of seminal gaming events, there's many moments where it seems like a miracle that the game even came out at all, when you look at the difficulties that Will Wright had in making people see his vision. There's moments of happenstance, of coincidence, of bad luck and good luck, until finally you see the game out there, gradually gathering speed, spreading like a wildfire in your industrial area. It's a story that's always worth looking at, if nothing else but for an excuse to while away the hours once more, building your own vision. And so, let's look at how a game that was like nothing else before it, one with no win states or spaceships, or levels or plumbers or anything like that, became a phenomenon. This is the story of SimCity. For someone like the creator of SimCity, Will Wright, the world itself could potentially be a playground. His appetite for construction was insatiable. He built stunning replicas, immersed himself in electronics and robotics, whiled away hour after hour tinkering on Lord knows what, and even won himself the odd prize on occasion. Similarly, he was also thirsty for knowledge, at least in subjects that interested him. He spent a total of 5 years in college, moving through subjects like architecture and engineering, and devouring them while paying no attention to those that didn't interest him, until ultimately he left education behind without actually obtaining a degree. It wasn't as if this love of tinkering and practical mind left Wright unable to talk a good game, mind you. In 1980 he was clocked doing 104 miles per hour by an Indiana state trooper, but when stopped for questioning he convinced the patrolman that he was test driving a car for an automobile magazine, and the trooper let him go on his merry way. He wasn't doing anything of the sort. He was taking part in the US Express, an illegal coast-to-coast streetcar race that was a successor to the famous cannonball ones of the 1970s. Wright and his teammate, Rick Doherty, driving a Mazda RX-7 utterly tricked out thanks to Wright's knowledge of electronics, went on to win the event. As you might have guessed, a future at the head of the plastics business that his father had left to him was not something that appealed to Wright, and therefore he would do nothing of the sort. He may have been unsure about his long-term plans, but he was sure that he wasn't going to do that. Instead, he moved from his home state of Louisiana to California with his future wife, a painter named Joelle Jones. Amusingly, Wright's tinkering had provided the spark for the relationship. After Jones severed a nerve in her wrist, Wright built a little attachment that would allow her to continue painting. Will Wright already had a love for computers, starting off with an Apple II in 1980, but the move to Oakland would take him close to the Silicon Valley revolution and to the area where this somewhat restless creator, to say the least, would find a stable background. Will Wright would find a home for his first commercial creation about 20 or so miles away in San Rafael, home of the software house Broderbund. The Carlston Brothers company had already dabbled with everything from computer games to educational software in their short lifespan, but a sharper focus towards titles that leaned a bit more towards arcade action as opposed to traditional computer genres like strategy would help them really make their name, and they provided a suitable home for Wright's first released game, 1984's Raid on Bungelin Bay for the Commodore 64, a game that would be completely different to anything else that Will Wright would ever make, but that would also prove to be an essential part of his evolution as a games designer. Without Bungelin Bay, there is no SimCity. Raid on Bungelin Bay is a top-down action title that's a bit like a riff on Choplifter. You take control of a helicopter and you have to storm the base of the Bungelin Empire, a common enemy in a fair few Broderbund games. Rather than simply taking out as many waves of attack units as you can, the main gimmick of Bungelin Bay is that you have to take out the enemy's infrastructure with your bombs, specifically their main factories that produce the attack units and weapons. If you don't do this, then the enemy will eventually overwhelm you just through sheer numbers, so it's pretty important. It also might help if you take out roads and other points of transport, as that can slow the enemy down. Anything to give you a bit more time. You'll frequently have to go back to your offshore aircraft carrier, as that's the main way to replenish your supplies of ammo, and you also have to defend the carrier and stop it from getting sunk. If you lose your chopper, or if the carrier goes down, the game's over. Raid on Bungling Bay is an okay enough little game, even if it's perhaps not quite as memorable as some other action titles that were kicking around at the time. The gimmick does make it a bit unique, and you can see the influence that the game had on later titles like, say, the Strike series. It was a fine action title for the Commodore 64 in 1984, garnering a few positive notes and selling modestly, somewhere in the region of around 20,000 copies. However, it proved to be a sizable hit in a market where you might not necessarily expect it to be. When Hudson Soft converted the game to the Famicom and released it in Japan in early 1985, it was a big success, selling close to 1 million copies. You might wonder how a fairly decent, although not particularly graphically amazing, computer action title like Bungling Bay proved to be such a hit in this market, and that in itself is worth a bit of detailing. The reason for the game's success isn't so much down to the title itself, as it is down to the success of Broderbund's titles as a whole in Japan, and a lot of that was thanks to Doug Smith's classic Lode Runner. This rather well-known platformer from 1983 was itself a riff on a Japanese-made arcade game called Space Panic from 1980, which in turn was essentially a side-on version of the seminal early Japanese arcade hit Henko Alien. You climb ladders to collect gold, you can't jump, but you can defend yourself from enemies by digging holes for them to fall in. The game proved to be a popular title on computers such as the Apple II and C64 in the summer of 1983, and it was enough for studios in Japan to take attention. System Soft initially published a PC-88 version of the game in late 1983, and from there Hudson Soft decided to make a deal to port the game over to the nascent Famicom in the summer of 1984, with the result that Lode Runner would be one of the earliest third-party titles on Nintendo's console. And it was a huge hit. The first third-party game on the system to sell over 1 million units and then some, it soon made it to other Japanese home computers, to the arcade courtesy of IREM. There were several new versions released with extra levels created through the game's editor. It was massive. The upshot of this, naturally, was that Hudson and Nintendo wanted an awful lot more of Broderbund's games. They got them, and a lot of them were hits. Some people always wonder why Spelunker was such a big deal on the system. Broderbund's Japanese success is the reason why, and the game was a huge hit despite being, well, rather odd in its approach, to say the least. The same applies to games like Choplifter, Jordan Mechner's Karateka, and Raid on Bungling Bay. These games, a fair amount of which hadn't been all that successful back home, were big hits in Japan on the Famicom, and Broderbund were a big name on the system nearly a whole year before it was rechristened the NES and sent over to the West. And so Will Wright's first game proved to be a big success, one which he made a decent chunk of change from. Usefully, this afforded him a fair bit of time to work on his next project. It was a game that would evolve directly from Raid on Bungling Bay, although perhaps not in the way that you would expect it to. The curious thing that Will Wright found when making Raid on Bungling Bay, and particularly when designing the game's levels, is that he had an awful lot more fun using his level editor to build the Bungling Empire's bases and cities than he ever had when he was playing the game properly. Indeed, it rather stuck with him to the point where, after Bungling Bay was finished, he was still screwing around with the game's level editor, creating these little towns with the game's assets. It's here where the origins of SimCity can be found. As he got more and more into doing this, and thought of other things that he could emulate with the editor, he figured that if he was having an awful lot of fun doing this, then why wouldn't other people also have fun doing this? In the end, the idea of creation appealed more to him than destruction, the chopper would sit dormant in the hangar, and the building blocks of Will Wright's next game would be found in his level editor. Of course, there's more to it than that. A big part of SimCity also lies in Will Wright's quest for knowledge, and in the sort of things that he was consuming around the time he reached the end of Bungling Bay. He'd shown his work in Bungling Bay's editor to a neighbour who he thought might be interested, a man named Bruce Joff who was a city planner. Joff had studied under an MIT professor named J. Wright Forrester, who in the mid-1950s had devised a methodology known as system dynamics. Forrester's goal with this methodology was to examine the linearity of complex and often chaotic systems, or rather to examine how they were not linear and how the structure of a system could be just as, if not even more important in determining its behaviour than the individual parts of it. System dynamics attempts to take these systems and model them using stocks, flows, time delays, feedback loops, all sorts. Initially, Forrester's methodology was applied in the corporate world to industries and computer systems, but in 1969 Forrester wrote Urban Dynamics as a way of applying this methodology to the building and shaping of cities over time and, to quote from a research paper, as an attempt to identify the systemic structures behind urban development and urban decay. The book was very controversial at the time. One of its conclusions, that a great deal of the social policies that were meant to help cities could actually hinder their progress, was used by the Nixon administration as a reasoning for slashing programs that were designed to help those in poverty, saying that doing so would actually help those people. Joff passed urban dynamics on to Will Wright as something he could possibly apply to his crude city creator, and this book in particular sent him right down the hole of system dynamics. In many ways, SimCity is, rather than something that tries to represent an accurate simulation of planning and building a town, an implementation of Wright's take on Forrester's methodology in urban dynamics, and it is definitely one of the main influences for what SimCity ended up becoming. The effect that urban dynamics has had on various areas of the game, not just the play but what people interpret as its politics, is quite interesting indeed. There were other areas of influence, of course. One in particular was found in fiction, around the same time that Wright was delving into urban dynamics. Will Wright became aware of a short story by the Polish science fiction writer Stanisław Lem called The Seventh Sally. In The Seventh Sally, a robotic engineer of godlike proportions named Twirl comes across a long-deposed tyrant kin named Excelsius, who demands that his throne be restored to him. Recognising the damage that Excelsius could do if in charge of a real kingdom, Twirl instead creates a miniaturised simulation of a kingdom, encased in glass, for Excelsius to rule over as he sees fit. Excelsius, initially angered by something he perceives to be a toy, rules the land in the way he is accustomed to, ordering brutal laws and persecution. But as time goes on, he decides instead to nurture the land and abolish the martial laws and orders, for which the little people of his enclosed world are greatly thankful. In this story, Will Wright could visualise the flow of his game, and how a person may play it. How they might initially have fun destroying a world, bulldozing buildings or setting off disasters, but once that process eventually got rearing, they would find the real hook in rebuilding the city, or creating a new one, and actually building something that was set to last. One other thing that's worthy of note, something that can be and was indeed used by Wright to visualise the building blocks of SimCity, is the British mathematician John Conway's highly influential 1970 cellular automata, The Game of Life, or simply Life. The Game of Life is a beautiful thing. You input an initial configuration, or a seed, on a grid, filling it up with filled blocks. When you execute, the blocks behave according to a strict set of rules. Cells with fewer than 2 or more than 4 neighbours die, representing under and overpopulation. Live cells with 2 or 3 neighbours continue to live, and dead cells with 3 neighbours become live, representing repopulation. There is no way to affect this process once you hit play, it simply plays out until it reaches an end, if it does. It's possible to create many things with the game, all of which have been given various names over the years. Still lifes don't move at all, oscillators move in a sequence, spaceships move across the grid. People who are a great deal smarter than I am have applied the Game of Life to all kinds of areas: physics, economics, philosophy. There's a lot to unpack. But just on a primal level, even all these years after the fact, creating a seed in the Game of Life, pressing start, and watching its evolution feels a fair bit like the process of construction in SimCity, and one can see how it captured Will Wright back then. These are just a few of the foundations for SimCity, The things that helped Will Wright to take the game from a crude city builder based on a level editor where you could place or remove buildings and little else, to something much more in-depth and fully functional, that would emulate the various issues that a city may face, such as crime, pollution and congestion, that would feature the placing of zonal areas for residential, commercial and industrial property rather than just letting you plunk buildings down from the list, and so on. Some other influences were a bit more direct. Will Wright saw that software like, for example, Pinball Construction Kit by Electronic Arts were selling in decent numbers, and reasoned that if people were having fun creating their own pinball tables, again, couldn't they also have fun trying to create their own city? In a later interview for Tristan Donovan's book Replay, he also cited Mac Paint as a leading influence, just for the simple concept of taking this palette of tools, having your canvas right there, and creating whatever you wanted with it. As he was building his game, he was hoping to convince Broderbund to think the same way, and this was something that would prove to be quite the challenge. Will Wright set about building his game through 1985 on the Commodore 64, although it didn't as of yet have the name that made it famous. Initially, Wright's game was called Micropolis. He would give a player all the tools that they needed not just to build a city, but also to destroy one. Earthquakes, fires, tornadoes, a random plane crash, floods, and even the appearance of a gigantic sea monster who may well have been fashioned after Godzilla. Initially, the bulldozer was the only tool that players had to destroy cities, something that Wright basically saw as an eraser to correct mistakes. But he noticed how much fun the people he was showing the game to were having using it, and reasoned that the addition of being able to trigger disasters as well would further help players basically get it all out of their system before setting out on the real purpose of the game, that being creation. On the creative side, Wright used the lessons he'd learned from system dynamics not just to build systems, but to connect them, to show how a poor traffic system would lead to congestion, which would then lead to excess in other areas such as pollution or crime, for example. He built in more and more feedback for the player, not just in the addition of graphs and charts which showed the city's progress and potential in commercial, residential and industrial areas, but also in approval ratings for the player and a ranking system to determine how successful your city was based on its current population and population growth. And there were a few fail states. A poorly run city would eventually result in bankruptcy, in complete degradation, and ultimately in the Meier, that is, you, being run out of town on a rail, ending the game. At this stage of the proceedings, Wright was incredibly enthusiastic about the title. In around about 1986 or so, Micropolis on the Commodore 64 was fairly close to a completed work. The main trouble that he had wasn't really with the creation of the game, it was in making others see the game as he saw it. Broderbund struggled with the very concept of SimCity. They looked at it, made approving nods at the complexity of Wright's design, but the people in charge would always come back to one question. How do you win? At what point does all of this city planning and building become a game that you can achieve a victory in? Will Wright didn't much like this question. He constantly explained that to him, building a successful city that was personal to you was the reward. The win state, if there was such a thing, was to ultimately be satisfied with what you had built, a fully completed city that was perfectly self-reliant and would just be, without the need of any screens saying that you won. But unfortunately, Broderbund just couldn't get it, and ultimately, after essentially having the same conversation over and over for a few months, where Wright tried to convince them that all of these different ideas would work, and Broderbund simply couldn't get their head around the lack of a traditional game structure, the man and the company decided to part ways, with Wright resolving to sell his vision elsewhere. Unfortunately, Will Wright would quickly find that almost every other company he went to basically had the same questions and misgivings as Broderbund, if not even more so. A key moment came at one of the big CES shows. He went all around the houses, trying to sell any software company that had a stand on the potential of the game that he was working on. Nobody took Wright up on the game. Perhaps understandably, not many people have come forward to publicly say that they turned down the chance to publish SimCity, but one who has done is John Cutter, formerly the director of product development at Cinemaware. He listened to Wright's presentation and, while he actually liked the game, he thought that the whole thing was just way too far-fetched and that Will Wright would never be able to finish it. According to Cutter, he was pretty much the only person Will Wright spoke to at CES who even so much as liked the game. It's easy to imagine that a lot of other people had the same misgivings that Broderbund had. Perhaps also easy to imagine a lot of these software house guys sitting around in bars, asking each other if they'd got a load of this Billy White guy and thinking that he needed to get real and pull his head out of his ass, thinking of such ludicrous and impossible ideas that aren't even games, let alone something that could be sold. With the process of trying to sell a game on his own not necessarily coming naturally to Will Wright, combined with the dispiriting negative reactions and firm no's he received whenever he did try to sell it, he started to get a bit of a downer on the whole thing, to the point where he'd just about convinced himself that Micropolis was never going to see the light of day, and that he should perhaps look at other things. It was in this depressed mood that he found himself at a little Alameda gathering for developers in 1987, hosted by Jeff Braun, a young and ambitious entrepreneur who was hoping to find the next big game idea. Will wasn't doing much of a good job at the whole networking thing. He was pretty much sitting on his own, in a quiet haze of pizza crumbs and cigarette smoke. Braun took a bit of pity on him and went over to have a chat, at which point Wright reluctantly, and somewhat negatively, started to go through his idea, talking about the various aspects of his city building simulator and, perhaps inspired by the constant rejections he'd received, highlighting a whole load of reasons why they wouldn't work. And all the while Jeff Braun was listening, first casually, then intently, and then thoroughly enraptured. From out of nowhere, Will Wright had finally managed to find someone who completely and utterly got what he was going for, even if he'd had the energy for pitching thoroughly beaten out of him. Braun hoped to find a great game idea, something that he could work on the person with, something that would result in a partnership, in setting up a business, and achieving his ambition of becoming a name in the software industry. And in this somewhat shambling yet intellectually brilliant man, he'd found it. And in the more extroverted and fighting fit Braun, Will Wright had found the guy who saw the potential in his project even before he'd shown him a single screen of what he'd done. He'd finally found someone just as driven as he was towards making Micropolis a reality. Once Jeff Braun had finally convinced Will Wright that his own project was actually a very good idea and that they should work together, the pair set up Maxis with the initial aim of getting Micropolis out there, but rather than going with the C64 game that Wright had been working on all this time, Braun thought it best to port the game to the Apple Macintosh and the Commodore Amiga. While an obvious reason for this would be that the C64 was getting long in the tooth, Braun also reasoned that people who had these higher-end computers would be more business-minded, more adult, and thus more likely to play the game. At this stage, they did basically have the idea that Micropolis was going to be a game that primarily appealed to adult men. It was around about this time that the name of the game would change, upon discovery that there was already an active company called Micropolis, selling computer peripherals and other such items. In order to avoid the potential for any kind of lawsuit, the name of the game was changed to SimCity, a pretty straightforward shorthand for city simulation, something that was initially perhaps easier for people to grasp onto than Wright and Maxis's preferred term for the game, software toy, which would later be used as a grouping for their various sandboxes. The C64 version of SimCity would eventually see release in a form that wasn't much different from the game that Wright had been showing off at CES and the like to little avail, but not before the Amiga and Macintosh versions. Indeed, while the primary goal of Wright and Braun was to get SimCity published, it wasn't actually the first game to bear the Maxis logo. That would be 1988's Sky Chase, a much more simple combat flight game by Ralph Russell and Don Bayliss that's not very well remembered today, although it did get a few positive notes in magazines at the time. Again, somewhat amusingly, this action title isn't all that much like the sort of game that Maxis would become known for releasing, much like how Raid on Bungling Bay is a rather odd title for Will Wright. A bit of history repeating. Don Bayliss would go on to be one of the few folks credited with working on the 16-bit ports for SimCity, as Maxis welcomes a few other guys into the fold, and the game stops becoming a Will Wright solo project. Soon enough, the 16-bit versions are pretty much done. There's a few features in them that you won't find in the Commodore 64 original, although perhaps a lot less new features than you'd think. Still, at this time, Maxis Software are a pretty small and new company. If they're going to make SimCity a success, they're going to need to partner up with someone bigger who can really help get the title out there. Which again returns us to the old problem of trying to make other people see Will Wright's vision. But this time around, they would find someone. In fact, it would be someone Will Wright was already rather familiar with. Broderbund had only gone from strength to strength in the last couple of years, releasing successful games of all shapes and sizes, and even managing to get the odd bit of positive mainstream attention thanks to educational titles like the Carmen Sandiego series and what have you. Even if they'd ultimately rejected SimCity before, they were seen as ideal to work with and worth trying again. This time around, Wright and Jeff Bourne would find Broderbund to be a fair bit more receptive to Wright's game than they had been previously, thanks to both the shiny new 16-bit versions of it and a wider range of software gradually starting to creep into the market. They felt the time was right to give SimCity a go, although they did want a couple of things added. Not yet able to fully get over the lack of a proper win state, they got Maxis to add scenarios to the game that basically functioned as a limited time challenge to make a city a success, something either set in history or a bit more fantastical, such as one in Tokyo in 1954 just before Godzilla comes sprawling through, a scene which would actually be the basis for the game's original box art. The scenario satisfied Broderbund when it came to having a game of sorts, and at last, Maxis had a green light to get this show on the road. Finally, in February of 1989, SimCity was out there for the Macintosh and the Amiga, quickly followed by the original C64 version in March. Initial sales took a little while to get going, but word of mouth would spread about the games pretty quickly, in particular thanks to some very glowing write-ups from magazines. For all the misgivings that so many software houses had, the game proved to be an instant smash with the critics. Computer Gaming World, one of the most popular American computer publications of the time, were absolutely effusive, basically imploring people to buy the game so that Maxis could make sim-type games for everything. As we'll see, they kinda got their wish. The critics were consumed by it, in full praise of the game's sheer addictiveness and how it both felt satisfyingly realistic as a simulation and utterly engrossing as a game. Even before the most important version of the original game came out, the DOS version, which hit shelves in September, a lot of attention was being brought to SimCity, and not all of it was from the computer gaming press. In June of 1989, a journalist named Julie Law wrote an article for the New York Times titled "Making City Planning a Game," filled with positive commentary from architects, professors and the like about the new game that's making city planning available to everyone, at least within the limits of a computer screen. At around the same time, a feature was written about the game in, of all places, Time magazine, glowing about the game and its potential. These would be just the first of many mainstream articles for the game. The release of the DOS version of SimCity in September was the signal for the floodgates to open. It had already grown to be a hit on the smaller platforms that it started on, but the DOS version would sell in the hundreds of thousands. That and it would sell for a long time. SimCity was one of the biggest selling DOS games in 1989, in 1990, and in 1991, and even beyond that. Will Wright's vision had been fully realised, Maxis were the new hot name in computer games, and Broderbund were quite happy to have initially been warned about SimCity's potential. They reaped the rewards while a lot of other companies who'd spurned Will Wright's game had to eat crow. Even the faintest of legal issues, a complaint from Toho that resulted in the original cover art, featuring a giant dinosaur who's obviously not Godzilla at all, no siree, being replaced, could hardly make a dent in the SimCity juggernaut. At this stage we've perhaps reached the point where we should get in-depth into the experience of playing SimCity. It's time to experience the magic for ourselves. There's lots of ways to experience it, of course, seeing as SimCity ended up being ported to just about every computer going, and consoles too, but we are going to focus primarily on the DOS version, as it's most certainly the best known version of the lot. We've already seen a lot of the features that the game has to offer, the charts, the zoning, the approval ratings and all that. But where does SimCity differ from games in this vein that came later, like its sequels or others inspired by it? Well, there's a lot less guidance. In most versions of SimCity, you are kind of on your own, aside from direct reports of things that have gone wrong, such as traffic congestion, heavy pollution, or brownouts that require a new power plant. A big part of the original SimCity is using the data that's available to you and then trusting your instincts, because you don't have nearly as many unique buildings available to you. Aside from the zones, all you've got is police and fire stations, coal and nuclear power plants, a stadium, a seaport, and an airport. Most of these simply fill essential roles. So when you create a residential, industrial or commercial zone, a lot of factors go into whether that zone gets developed quickly or whether it struggles to be developed at all. What's the environment like? What's it positioned near? How's the transport links? And so on. As much as there are obvious no-nos, you should never put residential property next to industrial factories if you want them to have a high standard of living, there's a lot of other things going on, and some are a bit more chaotic than others. One of the outcomes of this is that SimCity is actually quite tough, no matter what difficulty you stick the game into. Even on the easy mode where you're given a cool 20k and nuclear plants don't have as much risk of melting down, a fair bit of restraint is required. It's very easy to just splash cash willy-nilly without much of a plan and end up with a large area very quickly that doesn't make an awful lot of sense, doesn't develop much, and leaves you without a pot to piss in. Building up a city should be a slower, more considered process. Seeing as you only make or indeed lose money whenever the annual budget report comes in, sometimes it might be best just to leave a city for a little bit and see if what you're doing is actually going to work out. There are of course ways to game this system a bit. Someone could start with a tiny little area, leave the game for a good while at the fastest setting, hell just up the cycles if you're in DOSBox, and make bags of money without that much risk of disaster damage. You could also min-max the taxes, set them to the max of 20% every December, get your year-end budget, then put them to 0% in January. That's a consequence of the game's age perhaps, and it being one of the first to do this sort of thing. Even so, if you play normally, it will definitely take you a good few goes before you start building cities that will actually work. SimCity's best quality though, without a doubt, is that you're going to be dedicated to doing such things because this game moves fast and is very addictive, even now. The whole process is rather immediate, and you can spend an awful lot of time building up that city, tinkering with it, making changes here and there, and of course, reacting to any problems. A huge earthquake that decimates your city can, of course, be disheartening, especially when it felt like your city was just about to turn the corner, but then the new challenge comes in dealing with the consequences of the disaster, bulldozing areas to stop fire spreading and so on, and then rebuilding again, recovering from the catastrophe. Of course, this game is chaotic. Just because this happened once doesn't mean it can't happen again, and this time it could be a tornado, it could be a nuclear meltdown, or worst of all, it could be Godzilla. But hey, this is a pretty volatile bit of land that you're on. Of course you can trigger all of this yourself if you want. Sometimes you might just want to rip the whole thing up and start from scratch, and disasters are a pretty good way to do that. Most of the included scenarios are also based around responding to a major disaster, usually over the course of about 5 in-game years. They're fine and all, but in the end not too many people really bothered with them, as they much preferred creating their own city rather than working with something that's already built. It feels a little silly to talk about presentation and the like when it comes to this game, as, with the exception of one version we're going to look at, there's not exactly an awful lot to say. There's no music, and the graphics are quite low resolution even by 1989 standards. Later versions of the game do give you the option to change the graphic tiles on the fly, which is pretty neat. You get a whole bunch of options ranging from medieval times to future Europe and America, the Wild West to a sweet little moon colony. We can talk about the general interface, which is pretty good and functional for the time. There's not too much that's unnecessary, everything you could want is accessible immediately, and all that helps the game to run fast, which is one of the key factors of its success. You may well want to consult the impressively large manual in order to get an idea of what you're actually doing, but then that's something expected and, hell, somewhat missed these days when it comes to games like this one. Of course, later games would make a lot of improvements to the quality of life, and would be deeper and more complex experiences in general, but the original game is still a very accessible one, if you don't mind the more bare-bones nature of it all. It also feels a little silly to talk about how accurate it is as a simulation, as a lot of folks in the mainstream did back in the day. The answer to that question is not very. But then SimCity, for all the big puff pieces and experiments that spawned from it in the mainstream, was never purposefully built to be an accurate simulation of city planning, and Will Wright was often pretty careful to say that he wouldn't ever consider it as such. SimCity indeed is first and foremost a game, and Will Wright always saw it as a game. Again, talking about SimCity for Donovan Tristan's replay, Wright said that it was hopeless to approach SimCity as a predictive endeavour, and that it was always meant to be a caricature of how a city worked, not a realistic model. Not that the game doesn't have an educational purpose, it certainly did, and we'll see that too in a little bit. But ultimately the quality of the game is what allows SimCity to stand up and still be an enjoyable little experience, even if the genre it helped create has moved on an awful lot in the last 30 plus years. You can see why it grabbed so many people's attention. Not just the adult males with fancy computers that Maxis and Broderbund expected to get, but people of all ages, regardless of gender, and a fair few people who previously had no interest in computer or video games whatsoever. Now of course the DOS version of SimCity is the most famous one, but there are many others to consider. The success of SimCity meant that there were a lot of ports. A lot of these ports are pretty different too, and it's definitely worth looking at a few of them. In fact, there's a good argument to say that the DOS version isn't even the best one. So let's have a look, shall we? Of course there's the myriad of other PC versions, the most famous being SimCity Classic, the Windows 3.1 version of the game that came out in 1992. There's a few neat little quality of life improvements here. You can move toolbars around, and you can also bookmark areas of the map, nice if there's something you want to switch to quickly. Aside from these little changes and some actual music this time around, it is pretty similar to the DOS game, but it is absolutely one of the most popular versions, one that helped the game sell long into the 1990s. The other beefy micros all have their own versions, starting with the Amiga and Macintosh of course, the first two to be released. The DOS version does kind of dwarf both of these ones, being a lot friendlier when it comes to design, but that's not to say the game doesn't work very well indeed on either of them, it's just that the DOS version has the advantage of being developed a little bit later. It is probably fair to say, mind you, that for Maxis, unabashed fans of the platform that they were, the Macintosh version of the game absolutely took precedence over the Amiga one, in all of its monochrome glory. It certainly had a great deal of impact on the platform, to the point where it is thought of as a bit of a cornerstone of Macintosh gaming. After all, it's not too often that a famous game comes out on the Mac before it comes out on PC. And we obviously can't go through the early versions of the game without making note of the Commodore 64 title. Not the first one to be released, but the first to be made by a long distance, and it very much shows. This is the proto-SimCity, with some quite annoying foibles, such as having to bulldoze every single little tree before building on the ground, less graphs and stats, and a highly unfriendly user interface. It's a bit of a shame that this didn't get a bit of a lick of paint before getting put out there, although Maxis understandably had higher priorities than the C64 in 1989. As it is, being that it's basically the same as the Micropolis version that Will Wright was shown to various software houses, it provides an interesting window into the building blocks of SimCity. And then of course there's the other 8-bit micros. Here's where things really do get quite interesting. Yes, you can play SimCity on both the ZX Spectrum and Amstrad CPC, in versions that were headed up by Infogrames. Needless to say, the graphics have obviously taken a bit of a hit, but they're not all that bad for the systems, and no features have been taken out. It can be a little irritating to switch from moving your view around to putting roads and buildings down, but on the whole, this is a very effective version. But that's not the end of it. There were versions of SimCity for the BBC Micro and the frickin' Acorn Electron. Released by Superior Software, these are amongst the last commercial titles for both computers, published in 1990, several years after Acorn had basically abandoned them, particularly in the case of the Electron. And for the platform, they are absolutely stunning. This is SimCity in a whole 32 kilobytes of memory, and almost no features have been taken out. The programmer for these versions, Peter Scott, was a brilliant man who also blessed the Acorn faithful with versions of games like Barbarian, Last Ninja 1 and 2, Hostages, Ballistics and Predator. Variable quality games to be sure, but ones that punch far above the system's weight. However, he considers SimCity to be the best work of his whole career, and it's easy to see why. A bit later on, we also have some other versions for beefier computers. The Acorn Archimedes naturally got a version of SimCity, one that was ported by Chrysalis Software. It's fairly similar in appearance to the DOS version, albeit squashed somewhat and with the addition of a few more sound effects. I suppose it's passable, but not the best version. The Commodore CDT-V one, yeah, seriously, is quite the oddity, a version by Infogrames that's one of the few to really beef up the presentation with music, fancy graphics, an intro and all that. The problem is that they also decided to change the interface, and in doing so made it incredibly clunky. It seems to take so long to actually do anything compared to other versions. On the whole, this version, also released for the CD32, is for me pretty easily the worst version of the game. Also in the realm of oddities, we have the Unix X11 version of the game. Another one where business picks up and we really start exploring new horizons for the title. This version of the game, developed by Don Hopkins, features some of the strongest graphics for any version of the game, plenty of improvements, and biggest of all, SimCity Net. Yeah, it's multiplayer SimCity. This version of the game would later on, with the agreement of Electronic Arts, be open sourced and made much more widely available under the name of Micropolis after the game's original working title, and Hopkins himself would go on to be one of the leading artists on the original version of The Sims. But as far as the best version of the game goes, as well as one of the most important, well, for me there's no contest. The best version of SimCity is the one on the Super Nintendo, ported to the console by the Big N themselves. You might initially wonder how a game like SimCity would work on a console, but it's actually not that big a jump. The game itself is fast-paced enough to more than handle being played on a console, the game is simple enough already to not require much to be pared down further, and honestly, it's easier to play SimCity on a joypad than it is to play it using a mouse. This is one of the reasons why the 8-bit micro versions on the Speccy and Amstrad work well, actually. They're keyboard only, and the same applies here. You kind of want to keep everything nice and straight with SimCity, and whereas it's easy to slip up and make mistakes with a mouse, requiring frequent trips to the bulldozer, a keyboard or a joypad basically removes that problem. The controls aside, Nintendo did a lot to basically make SimCity their own, and Maxis most certainly made a note of a lot of their improvements. SimCity on the SNES is the game that introduces bank loans, essentially a normalisation of the DOS version's fund cheat code, but without an earthquake hitting after excessive use. It also introduced presents, special buildings that help improve your city after you reach a significant milestone. Your own house, casinos, amusement parks, a fountain. They can be very helpful. Both of these things would end up in SimCity 2000. There are of course some typical Nintendo touches. One of the presents is a statue of Mario, and Godzilla gets subbed off and replaced by Bowser. And of course there's the introduction of Dr. Wright, based on the man himself and ready to give you a lot more in the way of hints and tips. Dr. Wright would become an appreciated Nintendo character in his own right, later making cameo appearances in Link's Awakening and the Super Smash Bros. Series. We also have to talk about something we haven't talked about a lot when it comes to other versions of this game. Presentation. Graphics are pretty as well as being functional. The music? Absolutely beautiful. A perfect soundtrack for building a city. The intro? Iconic. This was a launch title on the system in North America and Europe, and it's one of the best introductions to playing games on the system thanks to that intro alone. It doesn't even need to use much Mode 7. It's odd really. In a way, the SNES version of SimCity perhaps started a common trend for the series, in which the bods at Maxis, or EA later on, get the ball rolling with their game, something innovative and popular and highly worthy of plaudits, at least until you get to SimCity 5, but then someone else does end up coming along, taking the ideas and the formula, making it their own and making it better. It's something that arguably started with the SNES version of SimCity and continues all the way to the likes of Cities Skylines nowadays. But in any case, to me, this is the definitive version of the original SimCity. Frankly, it's not even close. That said, it's not as if Will Wright's role in this version of the game was purely limited to being the mascot. After all, SimCity came to Nintendo because Shigeru Miyamoto was keen to develop a city building game of his own for the SNES, only to discover that Wright had beaten him to it. Miyamoto didn't think he could improve on SimCity simply by making a different city builder. And so, the pair met at Maxis's HQ in Emeryville, hit it off immediately, and after Nintendo had paid a reported sum of well over $1 million for the SimCity license, Wright flew off to the Nintendo HQ in Kyoto, where he and Miyamoto spent a week working on redesigning the game to better fit the machine. So yes, a big portion of the Nintendo SimCity is down to a collaboration, however brief, between two of gaming's most successful ever designers. Little wonder why it's so good then, really. It should also be mentioned that Nintendo did also work on a NES version of the game. In fact, it was pretty damn close to completion in 1991 before it ended up being abandoned. It sat undiscovered for a long time, until 2017, when it was discovered in the wild and ultimately released by Frank Cifaldi at the Video Game History Foundation. And with that, we've gone through an awful lot of SimCity's ports. Not all of them even, but certainly the ones that are worthy of note. We're still not done, of course. We have to talk about SimCity's continued crash into the mainstream, and how Maxis sought to capitalise from it with a whole line of other sim games. SimCity's mainstream piercing wasn't just limited to a couple of curious articles at the time of its release. It seemed to dip in and out of the news for a good couple of years or so. It had an impact in everything from classrooms to universities, where SimCity quite frequently was used as a teaching tool. Maxis paid attention and eventually released a special Teacher's Edition version of the game, complete with classroom notes and worksheets. It even had a bit of an impact in the political world too. It's hard to talk about SimCity and not talk about politics because how many other games have actually had a definable impact on the political process? Well, this one has. There are the two most famous examples, of course. There's the case of the Providence, Rhode Island mayoral election, when the Rhode Island Journal, based on a suggestion from a school kid, asked the 5 mayoral candidates to run a simulation of Rhode Island and see how they did. While various candidates accidentally bulldozed whole neighbourhoods and allowed crime to run rampant, Vincent Buddy Cianci, the former mayor who'd just come off a spell of jail time, managed to make improvements to the city, and he was declared the winner. Who can say as to whether Cianci's stewardship of a simulated Rhode Island had any effect on his campaign numbers, but he did go on to win the election. Then there's the use of SimCity as a means of political attack. In a Detroit News article in 1990, the columnist Chuck Moss detailed how he'd let Godzilla run rampant in the game's Detroit 1972 scenario, and then compared the results with the performance of the city's longtime mayor, Coleman Young. His conclusion, as you might expect, was that Coleman Young's leadership was much more damaging than that of the monsters. SimCity could be argued as one of the most political games of all time. The original game has got everything, without even needing to reach into later experiments in city building like the staggering Magna Santi from SimCity 2000. In a Los Angeles Times article from 1992, Larry Borowski talks about how when he played the game, it turned him into a stone-cold Republican hell-bent on nothing but growth, growth, growth. One city planner said, in all seriousness, that SimCity could hold some lessons for Los Angeles in the wake of the citywide Rodney King riots. And the folks behind the game weren't ones to sit on the fence. Jeff Bourne details how it's basically baked into the game that your nuclear power plant is going to melt down and decimate your city in 100 years or so, because they're not fans of nuclear power plants. And so they made the nuclear plant the game's Chekhov's gun, where you don't know when it's going to go off, but at some point it will. People noted that if you don't mass transit the hell out of your city with roads and railroads working in harmony, it's doomed to failure. Congestion, pollution, and crime will all choke it. And you don't get much more direct a statement than Jeff Bourne saying that we're pushing political agendas. What those political agendas are deemed to be have often depended on the people who write about it. Free market advocates have criticised the game for its statism, proclaiming that the game's equations must have been devised by faithful socialist city planners. Socialist outlets have questioned the game's neoliberal take on city planning, and neoliberal publications have highlighted the game's progressivism. This is almost fitting, really. When Wright was profiled for The New Yorker in 2006, the author John Seabrook considered the possibility that Will Wright, never not restless, enthusiastic and eager in the pursuit of ideas and knowledge, was more content making games than he was attempting to bash the various conflicting ideas in his head into a consistent and coherent philosophy. Wright's thoughts are best summed up in his interview for Tristan Donovan's Replay. One of the fun things is that a model like SimCity gives you something to reflect against. In fact, when people start arguing with the model, that's when I think it's been successful. When people are playing a game like SimCity, which is one set of assumptions, it clarifies their own internal assumptions. And then, when they can start arguing with it, it's crystallised in their internal model to the point where they can now argue against that model. So in some senses, I think that's the point of it. As far as influence goes, naturally there's a lot to say again, both inside and outside of the gaming sphere. It did inspire quite a few people to go into city planning and architecture and the like, no matter how much Will Wright might have thought that it wasn't an accurate simulation of city planning or whatever. In the world of games, SimCity's influence was off the scale. Sid Meier was directly inspired to create the original civilization, thanks to SimCity, and later on he called it one of the 3 most important innovations in electronic gaming, grouping it with the invention of the PC and the Nintendo seal of quality. He, like Will Wright, initially thought that the game would mainly appeal to architects and city planners only, but was quite happy to be proved wrong. EA founder Trip Hawkins has been more than open about his regret at not picking the game up, while Peter Molyneux recalled the joy of getting pissed off with all the needy people and hitting them with disasters, in true God game fashion. It was a sizable influence on games like Westwood's Dune 2. Yutaka Ute Saito, creator of a game called The Tower that Maxis would eventually release as Sim Tower, didn't leave his Macintosh for 24 hours. There are many stories of the game's influence on people, and it'd be tough to go through them all. But there's no real doubt that it's amongst the most innovative PC games of its era, even before you try to figure out just how many people were introduced to gaming just through playing it. Maxis, for their part, were quite keen to take what they'd done and, just as Computer Gaming World had suggested, take it even further. If you can simulate a city, well, what else can you simulate? Maxis' initial efforts to make Sim a brand beyond simply SimCity are an interesting bunch. They ranged from games that were pretty big deals at the time, to games that failed and basically sunk without a trace, to the odd import games that were taken and welcomed into the franchise, to games that were based around important political questions of the time, and even to games that were created for companies. In the wake of SimCity's success, a lot of companies and even government departments wanted a version of the game that was tailored for them. Everyone from the Australian Tax Board to the Central Intelligence Agency were calling up Maxis, even though they were initially reticent about doing such things. While a fair few of these games were failures, the continued great success of SimCity, and indeed SimCity 2000, which we shall perhaps cover at a later date, did allow Maxis some legroom when it came to wild experimentation, and trying to stick the sim prefix on an awful lot of things just to see what stuck. Of course, it would be several years before something actually did stick, something that we can allude to when we get to this video's finish, but for now let's have a quick look at what Maxis came up with. The first and certainly the most successful of these games was SimEarth. Much like SimCity, SimEarth, which Fred Haslam was the lead designer on, has a text at its heart, in particular the Gaia hypothesis by English scientist James Lovelock, who served as an advisor on the game. The result is certainly quite a pretty model for the time. You get this whole simulation of a planet, with life teeming all across it, events seemingly happen that are joined with everything else, and it was quite successful back then. As a game, especially nowadays, it's quite a tricky one to grasp, far more so than SimCity. It can be quite overwhelming with all the various options on display, and it can be tricky to get feedback, although you do get a rather detailed model of the planet as a face, complete with its mood. Usually when I played the game it was always saying, "Stop that," as I screwed around and threw endless meteors at it. Did I ever get a whole lot further with SimEarth than that? Not really. It's the most godlike of all these Maxis games, the one where the whole planet is in your grasp, but it can be tough to really get into. Sim Ant from 1991 was the next game that Will Wright took the lead design role on, and even if it's not quite on the level of SimCity, it's probably the best game of all these various sim titles. In Sim Ant, you take charge of an ant colony. You're always in charge of one individual ant, and you can burrow and expand your underground base, you can explore the land, you can try to gather supplies, you can compete against a rival ant colony. Eventually your ant will die for whatever reason, at which point you'll be reborn as another ant, assuming there's an egg for you. It's an intriguing concept, certainly. Even if it's not necessarily a brilliant game, it's nice for a Maxis game to have a certain sense of competition about it. Again, this game was pretty popular at the time, even if it's not quite as well remembered nowadays, and it's certainly a lot better regarded than some of the lesser sim games that we're just about to get to. A fair few of the sim games are just boilerplate affairs that are incomprehensible, or they're just the typical Maxis formula tacked onto something that's not interesting. Say hello to the likes of Sim Life, which makes Sim Earth look like a piece of cake by comparison. Or Sim Farm, which is a fairly dull take on the SimCity formula, only on a farm. You have the typical things: a few scenarios, an experimental mode, the opportunity to throw some disasters in whenever you get bored. Sometimes more positive results occurred when Maxis went outside to look for games that fit their brand. Not only did they take the excellent original Take the A-Train from Artdink in Japan and released it in the West as simply A-Train, but they also grabbed the Tower and released it as Sim Tower. It's an inspired game where you're now in charge of creating a single high-rise building rather than a whole city, and there's a bit more playability here than there is in the likes of Sim Life or what have you. Not a big hit or anything, but a game that had a little niche and is quite well remembered. The creator of the title, Yutaka Ute Saito, would later release a sequel called Ute Tower before moving on to his most famous game, the weird, wonderful, and very popular Seaman for the Sega Dreamcast. Then we get into some rather odd territory. Few games are quite of their time like 1993's Sim Health is, possibly Maxis' most nakedly political title. I mean, how do you fancy playing a game that's based on the early mid-90s debate on healthcare in the United States, where your main aim is to create policy and get re-elected? Where you can examine in detail all the main solutions to the country's healthcare problem that politicians had presented at the time, and even control the assumptions people have about them. Where you're given a score based on a set of questions you answer about your healthcare beliefs and how consistent the policies you enact are with them. It's an oddity, to be sure. Personally, I made sure every treatment was covered, no matter what, introduced universal healthcare at the federal level, and then did not do all that much else. I ran health insurance companies completely into the ground and the surplus was astronomical, but the people seemed to like me a whole lot anyway. Yeah, it's an intriguing piece of software. Not much of a game perhaps, and quite a high-profile failure at the time, but a very curious piece. Even more so as it was by far the most high-profile game, indeed the only publicly released one, developed by Maxis Business Simulations. This rather odd division of the company based all the way out in Monterey, headed up by the late John Howes and seemingly always at odds with the company's home base in Orinda, developed Sim Health following an approach from the Markle Foundation, a non-profit organisation built around advancing public debate and discourse on government issues, such as healthcare. Speaking of Maxis Business Simulations, we get to the game that was, for a long time, the company's great lost holy grail. Maxis struck a deal with the Chevron Corporation, and they made a prototype called Sim Refinery for them in 1992, a piece of software that was based on the company's Richmond plant and was simply designed to teach employees how their refinery worked. Very little information was released about it at all. The game wasn't released to the general public or anything like that, and there wasn't a whole lot of anything until 2020, when Phil Salvador at the Obscuratory website released a lengthy and beautifully written article on the history of Maxis Business Simulations. His take on a largely unknown side of this famous company is essential reading, and I'll link it in the description. A couple of weeks after the article's release, a commenter on Ars Technica named Post Bebop friend to a retired chemical engineer, revealed that he had in his possession what was in all likelihood the only copy of Sim Refinery still left in existence, and in due course it was uploaded to the Internet Archive, finally allowing people to look at Sim Refinery in the flesh, a triumph for software preservation. And so it's what you're seeing now. It feels rather silly to comment on its qualities as a game, considering that it's akin to a prototype made for a company and based in large part on Sim Farm, but it certainly is something to be able to at last see it in action. And with that, we can perhaps leave the coverage of these other Sim titles behind. There are plenty of others, of course, the likes of Sim Town, Sim Copter, Sim Park, Sim Golf, Sim Tunes and so on, but they belong more to the time period when Maxis released SimCity 2000, even if once again they're mostly much lesser titles than anything Maxis put out with the SimCity name on it. As previously mentioned, it would take some time before Will Wright was really able to make something else with the Sim name that would be a hit, and when he did, it would make up for all of these misses and then some. Mind you, the genesis for that title did come all the way back in 1991, in the wake of the original SimCity success and while all these other Sim titles were going around, when he was helping his young daughter Cassidy with her dollhouse. Will Wright, naturally, got thinking about the mechanics of a dollhouse and how it pared a simulation of living down to bare essentials. What reason exists to justify this item being in a dollhouse? What's the justification? These were the thoughts going around in his mind, and he started to apply them to the various objects in his own house. In a shocking turn of events, they were thoughts he'd have to implement into reality when, in October of 1991, the Wright family home was entirely destroyed by the Oakland Hills firestorm. As Wright and his family went about replacing their belongings over the next few months, the questions of what do people need and why do they need it again continued to run through his mind. And it's these events that would ultimately form the ideas for what was at first called Dollhouse, and later became known as The Sims. Of course, that's hardly a story we can start telling now. This is a video about SimCity, and it's a video that's almost at its end. Hopefully it's been an informative ride through one of the most important PC games of them all, one that we have to thank for an awful lot of the other incredible games that we've enjoyed over the years, while also being a great game in its own right. Perhaps at some point we'll come back to this story and have a look at the sequels. There's plenty worth writing about there, that's for sure. But for now, just as someone would take a look at a completed city and decide that there's not much else to add for the moment, it's time to finish up here, to thank you for watching, and as ever, to say bye for now.